Welcome to another PureRead audiobook. It's wonderful to have you with us. Before we get started, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. Supporting us in this simple and easy way ensures we can continue adding more delightful audiobooks for your listening enjoyment. The following story is copyrighted PureRead Limited, the home of books you can trust. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy. John and Catherine, Western Historical Romance by Emma Morgan. Chapter 1. A cool autumn breeze lifted John Rusher's thick hair from his collar and sent a chill down his spine. The sun was still shining brightly and warming his shoulders, but winter would be coming before they knew it. The changing of the seasons brought a certain sense of awareness with it, as though every creature suddenly knew it was alive and appreciated the fact. John was no different, and he pulled in a lungful of the crisp air as he contemplated everything that must be done to get himself and his family through the winter. The insulation in the big house could use some improvements. His brother Joshua had already fixed the pipe over the wood-burning stove, but there were still some cracks around the door frames that needed to be mended before cold drafts started coming through. John had read recently that a source of cold air into the fireplace would keep it burning hotter and make the house warmer, so he would have to convince Jed to let him drill through the side of the house. His brothers would take care of chopping firewood and drying meat to last them throughout the season, but John had his own duties. "Where's your head at right now, John? Or dare I ask?" Jed joked from the driver's seat of the wagon. "I don't think you've said a word since we left the farm." John shook his head and studied the businesses that flanked the main road of woodland as they came into town. Others were preparing for winter as well. Women were carrying home long bundles of thick fabric, and men were laying in plenty of tobacco and grain. Just thinking about all the things that need to be done. There's a lot to do before the cold months, and I still want to put that gate opening mechanism together. He pushed up his glasses as he once again ran through the plans in his head. "The one so we can get through the gate without getting off our horses?" Josiah asked. He was one of the youngest Rusher brothers, and he was always eager to help out with John's projects. He gave John a playful punch on the arm. "That will be so nice." "It can wait," admonished Jed as he searched for an open place to park the wagon. As the oldest of the Rushers, he took his duty as eldest brother seriously. He ran his farm and his family with a firm but gentle hand. "Right now, we've got a wedding to attend. I don't think either the groom or the bride will appreciate it if you're too busy engineering things to enjoy their big day." "I'm so excited!" squealed Abby from next to Jed. "This will be the first wedding since our own. Well, there was Joshua and Beth's marriage, but of course that was different. Anyway, I can't think of two nicer people to spend the rest of their lives together." Monroe, the general store clerk, had personally invited them to the wedding of his eldest son, Marvin. Weddings were a big deal in Woodland. The small town held a big sense of community, with everyone interested in what was going on with their neighbors. Most of the residents were men, having moved out to California to settle the land and hopefully make their fortune, so a man was lucky to find a bride. The rest of the town shared in the excitement, and this wedding was even more important since the Rushers were friends of the family. Abby clapped her gloved hands together and beamed down at her infant son. "I'm sure Jacob won't remember it, but it's also the first real outing that we've had as a family." Jed ran a hand through his thick, curly hair, which bounced immediately back into place. "I'm sorry about that. Things have been awfully busy around the farm over the summer." "It's too bad that Joshua and Beth couldn't have come as well," Abby remarked. "I think they would have enjoyed it." "They're too busy being lovebirds," John observed. Joshua was the second oldest rusher, and he had recently married a beautiful young woman originally from France. Although the rest of the family had been quite surprised by the union, they had embraced Beth fully. Joshua was putting the finishing touches on the house he was building for the two of them and their coming child, and he couldn't be bothered to do anything else. "I think someone is jealous," Josiah teased. "Are you ready for a wife of your own, John?" "Heck no." John smacked his younger brother on the arm. "I've gone this long without a woman to boss me around, and I'm not about to start now." "It's not as bad as you might think," interjected Jed from the front. "Why, a good woman makes a wonderful boss." He switched both sets of reins to one hand so he could put his other arm around Abby. "I don't mind getting ordered around every now and then." He guided the wagon across the street from the chapel and jumped down to tie the horses to a hitching post in front of the general store. "That's because you need a little bossing around," John argued. "Just think what would happen to all my ideas and inventions if I got married. I'd be too busy thinking about things like putting food on the table and cleaning my nails and having babies to do any of the things I really like to do." Now, you never know. Abby handed the baby down to her husband so she could get out of the wagon. You just have to find the right woman. There just might be a young lady out there who likes the idea of a thinking man. She smiled at her brother-in-law with a twinkle in her eye. But John wasn't paying attention. The railroad tracks came straight through town, running perpendicular to the main road, and a steam locomotive was just chugging into the station. It drowned out the sound of the church bells as it wheezed and puffed, great masses of smoke and steam flying out the stack. John stood for a moment next to the wagon, in awe of just how much weight a single engine could tow. The locomotive before him had no doubt been all across the country, hauling hundreds of people and thousands of pounds of freight with nothing more than coal and water in its belly. He was mesmerized by the movement of the rods that pumped the driving wheels. So much time, thought, and complete genius had gone into inventing such a thing, and then improving on it as the years passed by. John imagined himself in the engineer's position, working the throttle and the brake with just the slightest adjustments, navigating steep hillsides and sharp curves at wondrous speeds. In his mind, the power of the engine roared all around him as he guided the great iron beast up mountainsides and across deserts. "John. Jed was tapping at his arm, trying to usher him into the church. "I think things are about to start. Monroe won't appreciate it if we're late to his son's wedding." He raised a thick eyebrow and gestured with his head toward the chapel. Snapping back to the current moment, John shook his head reluctantly and came with his brother. "I don't know how you do it, Jed. Trains are a lot more exciting than women are." Jed laughed, a hearty sound that filled the air now that the train had finally quieted down. "You think that now, but you'll change your mind someday. I'm 27 years old." John countered. "I imagine that if there was a woman out there who was smart and funny and loved trains, I would have found her by now." His older brother shrugged, giving up. "Maybe you're right, John. Maybe you're right. But for now, we've got to get inside and see some other sucker sign his life away." The broad grin on his face belied his words, and the brothers ducked into the dark coolness of the chapel. Chapter 2. Another lovely ride on another lovely locomotive. Fred Langer, a portly man in his 50s, bounded off the train despite his considerable size, and then turned around to help his daughter down. "I could have taken any of the engines in the fleet, but I knew the Steam Queen would be the best one. She's yet to let me down. He stepped up to the front of the train and patted the metal side of it affectionately. "Nobody builds trains like I do." "It's a good thing you're so modest about it, Papa." Catherine Langer tossed an auburn braid over her shoulder and held herself steady against the railing of the platform. Her latest wooden leg was supposed to be the best-fitting one she'd had, and yet it left her feeling wobbly and unsteady. The foot carved at the bottom was slightly too large, making her feel awkward and unwieldy. She had tried everything she knew how to do to get it to work better, but it refused to seat correctly. She felt as though she might as well have been dragging a piece of firewood around behind her. Catherine shifted her weight, trying to find a comfortable position before her irritation ruined this trip for her father. You have to admit, Langer trains are the best in the business. Mr. Langer grasped the lapels of his pinstripe suit and took a deep breath. "Smell that California air, my girl. I've made the right choice for retirement." "You aren't anywhere near that yet." Catherine looked at the small town they had arrived in and tried to remember what it was called. Woodford? Logland? Something like that? It was quaint, with each storefront neat and brightly painted. The countryside that surrounded it was stunning, but she refused to be impressed. They wouldn't be there for long, so there was no point in getting attached. You still have many years of work ahead of you. "Haven't you seen this silver hair of mine?" Fred ran a gold-ringed hand gently over his scalp. His silver locks were slicked smoothly back, any traces of the black hair he used to have completely erased by time. "And my eyes are hardly worth a thing without these glasses." "No, my dear, it's not too early for me to think about finding a nice house with a cool porch where I can sit back, sip my tea, and listen to the trains go by." He headed toward the luggage car to watch the porters unload its contents. Catherine took his arm and limped along beside him. "But aren't you going to miss it? The trains don't build themselves, you know." Fred chuckled as he checked his gold pocket watch. "Nor do they buy themselves, or make smart business deals with other companies. But I don't plan on working until I die. I'd like to have a little time to spend with my grandchildren." Catherine raised a thin eyebrow. "Last I checked, Papa, you don't have any grandchildren." "Not yet, I don't." She let go of his arm and folded hers in front of her chest, wobbling a little in the process, but regaining her balance quickly. "I hope that's not what this visit is all about. Did Cousin Maggie tell you she'd set me up with some young man she knows?" Her father's cousin was a cranky woman in her 60s who always thought she knew what was best for everyone else. Catherine had only met her a handful of times, and that had been plenty. Her father had the decency to look surprised at the notion, but he wasn't a good liar. "Of course not, my dear. Maggie simply wrote to me and told me what a lovely area this was for my retirement. She knows that I'm looking to get out of the business soon, and she thought the California sun might do me some good. Besides, it's a nice vacation, isn't it?" "I don't know that I can call it a vacation if we're still talking about your trains." Catherine had spent her entire life listening to her father go on and on about boilers, drive wheels, steam domes, and fireboxes. It only made sense, since he had made a fortune several times over on the big machines, but she wished that he would occasionally give it a rest. "Then we can talk about those grandchildren I don't have." Instead, Mr. Langer replied with a grin. He stepped across the tracks to examine another engine sitting on a side section of rail. This one was emerald green with silver lettering. A slightly older model, but one that still worked well. "I do need someone to hand the business down to, my dear, and I don't want you doing it all on your own." As much as she resented having this conversation, Catherine knew there was no getting away from it now. Her father was truly concerned about the company he had built. He didn't say it, but she knew exactly why he didn't want her to be in charge of it. Nobody was going to listen to a woman, especially a woman with one leg. Then just hand it down to your vice president. No one can question you on that. But what about you? Fred Langer looked up at his willowy daughter with sad blue eyes. The business is important, yes, but how will I know that you're taken care of? He shook his head, troubled at the notion. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself, Catherine protested. She frowned to see her father's worry. He was a different man when he was thinking about her future than when he was thinking about trains, and she much preferred the glitter in his eyes when he watched a new engine fire up for the first time. So what if I fall down every now and then? I always get back up. He nodded, but Catherine could tell that her father wasn't convinced. In his mind's eye, he was once again reliving that fateful day when his baby girl's life had changed completely. I don't like the thought of leaving you alone. Catherine had no good response for this. Her mother had passed away when Catherine was just a tot. She could try to assuage his guilt by reminding him of their extended family. But the father and daughter team had spent so much time traveling with their trains that they'd had little time to get close to their relatives. Catherine had a few acquaintances, but her father was the one she leaned on, sometimes literally. I'll be all right, she promised. Now how about we stop talking about such gloomy things and get on with our trip? Mr. Langer looked dubious, but he nodded. That would be fine. I'll tell you what, why don't you head over to the inn and rest up for a bit? You've been standing on that leg for far too long already, and we're supposed to have the best accommodations in the whole town. You can freshen up from the trip, and I'll join you when it's time for dinner. Catherine began her usual protest that her leg was fine, but she bit down on it and smiled. She was a little sore from the ill-fitting prosthesis, and it would make for a much more enjoyable evening if she had the chance to rest first. That will be fine. I'll make sure they have some nice fresh lemonade waiting on you when you arrive. She turned, leaving her father to examine every bolt of the engines. The tiny town was astir with activity, far more than she would have expected for such an out-of-the-way place. Folks strolled back and forth across the street and up and down the boardwalks, each dressed in their finest. Catherine felt distinctly underdressed with her simple gown in a drab gray. Fancy dresses were fine during the right occasion, but she had often felt as though she didn't deserve to wear them. Silk gowns didn't match wooden legs. At first, it seemed strange that so many of the townsfolk were wearing their Sunday best on a Wednesday, but she soon realized the occasion when the church bells pealed out across the hillsides. A beautiful young couple emerged from the chapel, their faces radiating with love and joy as their friends and family tossed rice at them. In the crowd, she spotted a surprisingly tall man with dark curly hair, his little blonde wife with a chubby baby in her arms standing proudly next to him. That, Catherine thought, was the kind of life her father envisioned for her. It was the perfect family, happy and normal. As nice as it sounded, she knew she could never have that. Still, she had to admit that she liked the idea as well. It had been fine to grow up against an ever-changing backdrop, hopping from train to train in town, to town to town to town, while her father conversed with the best engineers and the biggest investors. It had given her a chance to see things she never would have otherwise, and to learn so much. Catherine had adored the massive machines even from a very young age, much to the chagrin of any adults who happened to see her hanging off the caboose with the wind in her hair. But she was an adult now, and at 24 years old she should have already been married or at least engaged. Catherine knew how men looked at her, though. They spotted her at a business dinner or a dance. glancing across the room with curiosity at her freckled cheeks, green eyes, and deep red hair. They were intrigued by someone who wasn't the standard of beauty, but who yet held a spark for life in the glow of her cheeks. Others were intrigued not by her looks, but by her father's money, and they eyed her with a hunger for wealth. It wasn't until they got closer and realized that she was missing an entire limb that they changed their minds, pretending that they had come across the room to speak to someone else, or simply changing directions entirely. It had hurt at first. Catherine had been hopeful that someone would come along and sweep her off her foot, but those dreams were quickly dashed. She had tried to hide her injury as much as she could, but everything always came out on the dance floor or even a walk in the moonlight. Even her wealthy father didn't entice them enough to look past it. Nobody wanted someone who was broken. Catherine would have been content to give up, relegating herself to a life on the rails, but it was clear that her father wasn't. She wandered away from the rail station and toward the inn, pondering just what kind of man might be willing to put up with her limping when she spotted a man standing a bit apart from the crowd. He was dressed like the others in a decent suit, but his jacket had come unbuttoned and was flapping in the breeze. The man's hair was dark and curly, and by the way it languished around his collar, it was clear he hadn't cut it in some time. He was dressed as though he was supposed to be going somewhere or doing something, and had no doubt come from the wedding, but the people around him were the last thing on his mind. The stranger stood with his back to the crowd as he studied the trains. Through his gold wire frame glasses, his green eyes traced every curve of the engine, and the cars, his lips parted slightly as though he was transfixed. Catherine had seen that look before on her father's face. She knew she should have been heading toward the inn, but Catherine turned and headed toward the stranger instead. If her father was determined to live near this town, then she might as well start making friends. One who was fascinated by trains was a good place to start. Chapter 3. If anybody asked, John would say that the ceremony had been a nice one, and that it had certainly suited Marvin and his young bride. He only hoped that nobody would ask, or that if they did, they wouldn't ask him to say the name of the bride, the color of the flowers, or what hymns were sung in the ceremony. He had filed into the church after his brother and sat down in the appropriate pew, but his mind had gone instantly back to his projects. There was the gate, opening mechanism to be built, and he'd had some ideas for a water heater that needed testing. Abby would complain if he spilled water all over her clean floor, but she'd be thrilled when she no longer had to heat it herself. Of course, he was going to need some more piping. Perhaps he could talk Jed into stopping by the general store before they left town. An elbow in his ribs from Josiah told him it was time to stand up, and he did so without paying any attention to the bride walking down the aisle or the subsequent prayers and vows. He was happy for Marvin, at least as much as he could be. But there were much more important things to think about. Finally, the new couple was officially married. The pastor announced the end of the ceremony, and the guests clapped and cheered, women whispering to each other about how gorgeous the bride looked and how lucky the groom was. John leaned toward his oldest brother and whispered his request to stop at the store. Jed rolled his eyes and shook his head. The store is closed today, remember? Monroe wasn't about to keep it open and miss out on his son's wedding. John blinked, as though he had completely forgotten where he was. Oh, right. Of course. You can come back another time. But truth be told, you probably have plenty of materials at home in the barn. The guests were filing out of the church now, and Jed tried to keep his voice down as he admonished his brother. I think I've tripped over plenty of pipe lately, so maybe you ought to use what you have before you go buying anything. "What do you care?" John asked, a bit too loudly. He earned several scowls from the surrounding guests and continued in a whisper, "I make a lot of improvements around that farm." "Yes, you do," Jed agreed, "but you also make a lot of mess. There are tools and gadgets all over the place, and you've taken up an entire stall in the barn with your junk." This wasn't his brother talking, John knew. Jed had never cared about any mess around the place, but he had suddenly started caring an awful lot once Abby came around. She had demanded that they all wear clean shirts, wipe their muddy boots before coming in the house, and chew with their mouths closed. She had probably been complaining to her husband about John's messes. He had tried to keep everything as tidy as possible, but his time was better spent creating than cleaning. As much as it chafed him to know that his sister-in-law was the one behind it all, John wasn't about to say anything. Abby was a good cook who put a hot meal on the table for all 7 of the Rusher brothers every evening, and he had discovered that he rather liked wearing clean shirts. Still, it only confirmed John's thoughts from earlier that afternoon that a wife was the last thing he needed. His tools and inventions would be banished from the house, and soon enough even the barn wouldn't be safe. No, John was better off alone with his thoughts. The crowd pushed out of the church, rice flying up into the blue sky to celebrate the couple's vows. John hung back until people started trickling to the inn for a reception. Then he knew he was free to do what he truly wanted to do. The train he had seen pull in earlier had been a lovely one, and it was still there. The engine was cherry red with gold trim and had the words "Steam Queen" carefully painted on the side. Someone must have cleaned it recently because it gleamed in the late afternoon sunlight. Most of the locomotives that came through Woodland were black and dirty, machines that had been made for work instead of pleasure. They came through town, dropped their freight and picked up passengers, and chugged off on their way, but the Steam Queen looked as though it was something different. If he hadn't known any better, John would have sworn it was a luxury vehicle for a big business magnate, but nobody like that would be coming into their little town. "It's pretty, isn't it?" asked a voice at his shoulder. John jumped, nearly knocking the woman over. He reached out to grip her arm and hold her upright, and she clung to him gratefully. "I'm so sorry. You startled me. I shouldn't have snuck up on you like that, but you seemed to be very engrossed by the trains." John nodded, taking his hand from her arm once he knew she was steady on her feet again. He thought he knew everyone in Woodland, and yet he hadn't seen this woman anywhere before. There was a spark of intelligence in her eyes that he knew he would have remembered. "I like to watch them when we come into town. They're a remarkable piece of engineering." She smiled. "You're an enthusiast, I see." He returned her smile, glad that at least someone understood his passion. Jed didn't want to hear about trains anymore, and Abby wouldn't listen to the first word. His other brothers were no better, and he could only hope that little Jacob might be interested in locomotives when he got a bit older. "I thought about getting a job with the rail company at one time, but I knew my brothers needed me on the farm. It just wasn't feasible. But I think it would be wonderful to just travel the countryside for a living. Don't you? All that beautiful scenery, all that beautiful scenery, all those different places." He had often imagined how much more he would have learned if he had been able to do such a thing. The woman shrugged slightly, her green eyes squinting as she watched the railway workers hook up a sleeper car. "I don't know. It might be a bit lonely." He laughed slightly, thinking about what an ironic statement that was. "It's lonely here. Everyone knows everyone, but they're all too busy working to spend any time together. There's never anything new or different." But out there are infinite possibilities. You could meet scientists and engineers from all over the country, collaborate with them on new ideas, and get inspired to create whole new inventions. It would be wonderful. He didn't know why he was sharing so much with this unknown woman, but he couldn't seem to help himself. A listening ear was irresistible. The woman looked to the trains and then back to John, tossing her auburn braid behind her shoulder. How much do you know about the trains and how they work? It's obvious you have a mind for these sorts of things. Never passing up an opportunity to show off his studies. John smiled. Well, not as much as I would like to. I spend most of my time improving our farm implements or making the house more efficient as far as heating and cooling. I've read extensively about them, but I'm no expert. No. She didn't say much, but it was enough to keep the conversation going. It was plenty for John. No, I'm no Fred Langer, if you know what I mean. But I do know that the chugging sound a train makes is from the steam depressurizing as it comes out of the stack. He stood a little straighter as he imparted his wisdom. John had tried to talk to the rest of his family about his interests, but they always brushed him aside. Judah, who was interested in reading any kind of books he could get his hands on, would listen for a little while. Even he got bored, though. Nobody appreciated the skill and brilliance that went into the things John was interested in. Actually, the chugging sound is the result of the steam entering and exiting the cylinder as the piston moves back and forth. She kept her eyes focused on the train as she spoke. The piston valve lets it in and out. John stiffened at the correction. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I mean, I've read an awful lot about this stuff." He watched her carefully, waiting for her apology and the subsequent questions about how he had learned so much just from books. But she was resolute. "I'm quite certain. The noise is more pronounced when the engine is just starting up because the piston hasn't built up any momentum yet." She looked a bit pleased with herself, with the corner of her mouth tipping up slightly. John knew that if he had been one of his brothers, particularly Jed or Joshua, he would have melted in a moment over that look on her face. Her eyes were innocent and yet intelligent, and her lips were the same pink as the flowers that bloomed in front of the house in the spring. There was no doubt that this strange girl was pretty, but that didn't matter for John. "I don't know about that," he finally replied. Recovering, "I think I would have read that." "There's a lot more to know about them than what gets printed," she responded, still with that bit of a smile. "Once you spend a lot of time around them, you get to understand them more and more. They're machines, but it's like each one has a different personality." She nodded toward the train yard as though she was recognizing old friends. John was used to being told to be quiet, to talk about something useful, or to quit yammering and go feed the horses, but never had he been out and out corrected on a topic he felt confident about. He knew that he should have been pleased to find someone who was not only knowledgeable, but bold enough to share her information. Instead, he felt sullen and insulted. "Well, I have something I must be doing." "Good day." He swiveled on his heel and stomped toward the inn and the reception. The truth was that he didn't care about the reception at all, and knew he was just going to sit around being bored, but the strange woman who knew too much about trains had left him no choice. He had to get away from her, yet he had no other place to go. He hunched his shoulders as he walked away, feeling her gaze on his back and hoping that she wouldn't try to follow. Ducking into the crowd, he rejoined his family and sat down for a meal. The food was good, but it didn't take his mind off of what had happened. Who was that girl anyway? Why did she know so much about trains? How come he hadn't seen her before? He should have asked her name. Soon enough, the music started. Jed and Abby danced with their baby between them, the picture of perfect harmony, and John could only resent them for it. "Aren't you going to join in the fun?" Abby asked when they finally sat down for a break. "I'm sure I've seen at least a few hopeful girls around the edge of the dance floor." She cast her hazel eyes around the room excitedly, looking for a dance partner for her brother-in-law. "I'm fine," John said glumly. "You don't sound it," Jed countered. "What about Mr. Johnson's daughter? I don't think she's taken." He pointed subtly across the room to a blonde girl who sat firmly at her mother's side, her wide blue eyes glancing around the room. She was young, and she looked as though she thought someone might jump out and eat her at any moment. John looked, but the young woman didn't interest him. He was going to stick by his thoughts earlier, that a female would only make trouble for him. The one near the train yard already had, and he'd talked with her for all of 3 minutes. No, thank you. "What about that one?" Abby suggested. "I don't know her, but I'm certain I haven't seen her dance." This one was at the very back of the room, and when John caught a glimpse of copper hair, his heart surged in his chest. The train girl was here at the reception, but as the woman turned, he saw blue eyes and a creamy complexion that did not match up with the woman he had met outside the chapel. John wasn't sure if he should be relieved or disappointed. "No, thanks." "Suit yourself." Jed took Abby by the hand and pulled her back out onto the dance floor, leaving his younger brother to sulk over his half-empty dinner plate. Chapter 4. Catherine watched the man go, shocked that he was so upset about being corrected. It was nice that he was interested in trains, but she couldn't help it that he was misinformed about them as well. Of course, she had grown up as the daughter of a successful railroad baron, learning the parts of the engines and how they worked from the moment she could walk. She didn't know what her first word had been, but she wouldn't have been surprised if it was steam or rails. It was just how life was for the Langers, and she had accepted it very early on. Unfortunately, the strange but handsome man she had tried to talk with did not appreciate her knowledge. It was obvious from the way he studied the great machines that he was a man who was interested in learning more, and she would have expected him to turn to her as an expert instead of competition. Catherine could have taught him quite a bit, and even offered him a tour of this steam queen. But if he wanted to be like that, then so be it. It looked, however, as though he was going into the very same inn where she was supposed to be staying. It wasn't the most palatial hotel she had ever seen, certainly nothing to compare to the architectural marvels she had stayed at in New York or Chicago. But it was the hub of entertainment in this little town. The 2-story building was a long one made of wood and painted white. Numerous windows looked out onto the street, inviting everyone nearby to join the party. The wedding reception had taken over the hotel, guests streaming in for food and drink and streaming back out to enjoy the cool afternoon air on the long covered porches that lined both levels of the building. Every light in the place had been lit, giving it a welcoming feeling that Catherine was certain didn't quite extend to her. She had never felt particularly out of place when she and her father traveled. After all, they had lived such nomadic lives that she was more comfortable on a train and operating out of a suitcase than when they settled down in one of their townhouses for a couple of weeks. The friends she made as a child were always temporary, and as she grew older, she ceased worrying about getting their addresses so that she could write, or even remembering their names. Catherine swept across America like a tumbleweed, never quite stopping and always on her way to somewhere else. But it disturbed her that this young man had been so offended by her statement. She knew perfectly well that what she had said was true, and if he had known who she was, he would have had no reason to doubt her. She only wished she had asked his name before she had offended him so, in order to know who to be angry at later. At any rate, she couldn't possibly go to the hotel. She would have to get through the lively reception crowd, and the man was in there. He was no doubt laughing with his friends over this strange girl who had tried to speak to him and demote him from his position as town expert on everything. The last thing Catherine wanted to do was hobble into the hubbub and endure everyone staring at her and her wooden leg. "Fine," she murmured to herself. "I'll just do some shopping instead." It wouldn't rest her leg as her father had suggested, but it would keep her away from both the train yard and the inn. She crossed the street to the general store, hoping to replenish her ink supply for her fountain pen, only to find the place had been closed for the afternoon. A large, handwritten sign in the window said, "Closed Wednesday afternoon due to wedding." Everyone else in the town must already have known, because she didn't see any other souls come up to the locked door and walk away disappointed. It seemed that the town had rolled up all of its sidewalks for the nuptials, since the milliner's was closed as well. Catherine hobbled further down the street, her leg aching in the prosthesis, and found that the only place open was the saloon. As that was no place for a woman, she turned grumpily back toward the hotel. Her father would be coming to join her for dinner soon. The reception was in full swing now, making it even more embarrassing for her to go inside. Catherine was curious what a self-important man like the one she had met liked to do at parties. Was he the kind to mill about, introducing himself to anyone and everyone and making them victims to his false knowledge? Did he sit in the corner and wait for his audience to come to him? And how did the rest of the townsfolk take him? Catherine knew that people in small towns often looked to someone they felt was wise, but she had a feeling they might be making fun of this man behind his back. Either that, or she was just bitter. The deepening evening ushered her toward the brilliantly lit building, but still she couldn't quite bring herself to go in. Instead, Catherine limped back across the road to the general store. Perhaps she could get a glimpse of the man somewhere in the crowd. If she knew where he was, she might be able to dart inside, check in with the clerk, and get to her room before the cocky man noticed her. She could only hope that her room was on the first floor, and she wouldn't have to make a show of clumping up the staircase. But the crowd in the hotel lobby was thick near the windows, and Catherine couldn't quite see. She eyed the wagon parked in front of the general store, noting how the pair of horses tied to it seemed quiet and calm. Whoever owned the rig probably wouldn't mind if she stood up on the side of it, just to get a better view. She would go nice and easy to make sure she didn't scare the beasts. Gripping the side of the wagon, Catherine put her good leg up first. She wasn't steady enough on the wooden leg to haul herself up on the strength of alone, but as she hoisted herself up to the side of the wagon, a heavy thunk sounded behind her, and her body refused to rise into the air. The shoe on her false foot had caught in a knothole of the boards in front of the general store. Worried that someone might come along and think she was rifling through the contents of the wagon, she pulled harder. Mr. Langer was always admonishing her to be careful about her feet, to be certain she didn't fall, to make sure she placed her steps carefully to ensure her balance. Catherine had always brushed him off, unconcerned with such things when she had been managing to get around just fine so far. But she understood now, frozen in such an awkward position, why her father had been so worried. It wasn't simply that he was her dad, or that he felt bad for what had happened to her. No, he saw the potential for what really could happen to her if she wasn't careful. Yanking harder once more, Catherine felt something give with a pop. As she flew over the side of the wagon, she felt the evening air brush against her leg. The wooden leg had not been freed from the knothole. The leather straps holding it on had. She crashed into the bottom of the wagon head first, and everything went black. Chapter 5. "Thank you so much for having us at your wedding," Abby gushed to the bride. Several strands of her golden hair had come free from her bun, but she smiled brilliantly despite the late hour. "We had a wonderful time." The bride replied with some similar courtesy, but John wasn't listening. He was ready to get out of the bustling hotel and back to the farm. There were too many people in Woodland at the moment, and he longed for the quiet solitude of home. Even if he had to take a lantern out to the barn and tinker with his stall full of junk, it would be more exciting than the party had been. He never should have agreed to come into town. But the bride didn't need to know that, and he smiled at her as he followed Jed and Abby. Thank goodness. "I thought we would never get out of there," he murmured as they came out onto the porch and a blast of evening air sent a pleasurable chill down his spine. "Weddings are dull." "You're just saying that because you haven't had one yet," Abby teased. Baby Jacob was wrapped up so tightly he looked like little more than a bundle of rags with a shock of dark hair poking out, and the new mother kept him close to her chest as she navigated the dark road to the wagon. Jed had her by the elbow, constantly watching guard over his wife. "I doubt that. I'm sure it would be just as dull. Right, Jed?" "I wouldn't exactly describe it that way," his older brother responded. "Terrifying, maybe." Abby slapped him playfully on the arm, and he laughed. "Well, it would be if I had to stand up in front of half the town like Marvin did. But I guess you have to have a big, too. Do when your father owns the general store and everyone knows you." Josiah jogged along next to John, barely containing his energy. "I thought it was great. There should be weddings here more often." He scuffed his boots in the dirt as he danced across the road. "I've never seen so many girls in one place. They do all turn out in their finest for a wedding," Abby agreed. She handed the sleeping infant to her husband as she climbed up into the wagon. "I don't recall seeing that many." John didn't mind raining on his younger brother's parade a little bit if it meant he wouldn't be bouncing all over the wagon on the way home like a small child who has been allowed to stay up past his bedtime. Maybe one or two. You just weren't looking. Even in the faint light that reached the wagon from the hotel, Josiah's face gleamed with excitement. I think a few of them might have been from the next town over, cousins or nieces of Monroe's family, because I hadn't seen them before. There was that one in the green dress. She was gorgeous. I wish I could see her again. I doubt she would be willing after the way you stepped on her toes. John hauled himself over the side of the wagon and landed in the bottom with a thunk, feeling some of the contents rolling around a bit behind him. It was going to be a long ride home with hardboards underneath him and Josiah in his ear. He pulled his collar more tightly around his neck. But Josiah's elation could not be mitigated by John's grumpy mood. "At least I had the chance to step on some toes. You wouldn't know since you refused to get anywhere near any women." He went around to the other side of the wagon, turning a curious eye on his sibling. "What's your problem tonight, anyway? I thought you wanted to come to this thing." John shrugged. He didn't owe an explanation to anyone, but he supposed he had been a bit of a sorepuss. "I guess I just wanted to see the trains." "That figures." Josiah lifted himself up onto the side of the wagon, then promptly dropped back down again. "What's this?" "Come on," Jed scolded impatiently from the driver's seat. "It's late enough as it is, and I'm not looking forward to navigating these roads at night. There's something over here stuck in the boardwalk." Josiah came up to the front of the wagon, where the eldest rusher had just lit a lantern to see the road by. He lifted it off its hook and came back to the spot in front of the general store. "You're never going to believe this." John rolled his eyes. "Try us. Or better yet, let's just go." Jed, I'm sure if you take off fast enough, he won't be able to catch up with us. We can have one peaceful night, at least. Josiah's face was impish in the flickering light from the lantern as he stooped over the boardwalk. Kneeling to get a better view from the back of the wagon, John easily confirmed what his brother had stated. The prosthesis stuck straight up out of the boardwalk like a branch, the leather straps at the top dangling pitifully. Someone probably just got drunk and tripped. But Josiah was intrigued. But I wonder who it belongs to. I don't know anyone with a wooden leg. Maybe we should get it out of the porch and bring it to the sheriff. Someone might be in trouble. His eyes were wide as he contemplated the possibilities. Just leave it, Jed finally ordered, settling the matter. Whoever lost it will probably remember exactly where he left it when he comes to in the morning. There are a lot of extra people in town tonight, and some of them have had more than enough to drink. He had been reaching down to pry the leg out of the wood, but Josiah reluctantly returned the lantern to its place and climbed into the wagon. Fine. You guys are no fun. Abby turned around. Someday, when you get married, you won't be any fun either. The younger brothers couldn't see her face, backlit as it was by the glow of the lantern on its hook, but they could hear the smile in her voice. May that be a very long way away, John mumbled. The wagon jolted off down the road, and the rushers settled down into silence. Chapter 6. A deep chill had settled into Catherine's bones, and she groped around blindly for a blanket to cover up with. Why was the bed at the inn so hard and uncomfortable? Surely her father could have made better arrangements than this, even if they had slept on the train. The Pullman cars were positively luxurious compared to this. Her joints and muscles complained as she felt around in the bed, and her chilled hands failed to find a blanket. The heavy thumping that resounded throughout the place was getting annoying. Why hadn't the hotel management told the party to settle down? It must be late given how dark it was, and why did her head hurt so badly? She hadn't been at the reception, and she certainly hadn't had anything to drink. She couldn't even remember eating, and her empty stomach rolled dangerously. Her eyes slowly and painfully peeled open, every tiny movement sending a spark of pain through her skull. It was then that Catherine realized the thudding sound was coming from the inside of her head. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, but a wave of dizziness washed over her. Her stomach rolled again, and she flattened herself back out against the hard wooden boards underneath her, sucking air in through her nose and pushing it out between her lips several times. She eventually maneuvered herself into a seated position. Wherever she was, this didn't seem to be the hotel. If it had been, she would have heard the muffled sounds of merrymaking in the lobby and dining hall nearby. There would have been a crack of light under the door from the lamps in the hall. At the very least, she would have had some blankets. Everything around her was cloaked in complete blackness, and she watched impatiently as shadowy forms slowly coalesced and her eyes adjusted to the darkness. She could see the faint outlines of rafters and gates and tools of various sizes hung on the walls with nails. The smell of the place was sweet and fresh, like a meadow on a cool morning, but mixed with the warmer tang of livestock. From the other side of the structure, she heard the soft noises of sleeping animals and shuffling hay. No, this definitely wasn't the hotel. A barn. But how would she have gotten in a barn? Catherine retraced the steps she had taken that day, trying to discern where she was. She and Mr. Langer had gotten off the train. There had been some conversation with him, and then some conversation with him, and then some conversation with the strange man who didn't like her. Oh, yes. And then the hotel and the wagon. The pain in her head told her just what had happened. She wondered just how long she had been unconscious. With a start that sent a new wash of pain through her body, Catherine realized that her wooden leg was nowhere at hand. She fished around in the back of the wagon, hoping that by some strange chance it had fallen into the vehicle with her. Her hands found an empty metal pail, several shotgun wagon ridges, a burlap sack, and plenty of straw, but nothing that felt remotely like her leg. For the first time in many years, Catherine felt tears burning at the back of her eyes. She hadn't cried since she was a little girl. People were disgusted enough by a young lady with a false leg, much less one who had a red, blotchy face from sobbing. But this was an altogether different scenario than a potential suitor who wouldn't look her way, or a torn gown. She was in a strange place, injured, and she didn't even have her prosthesis to lean on. Cautiously gulping to combat both the swirling of her stomach and her head, Catherine lowered herself over the side of the wagon. Clinging to the wooden sides for dear life, the descent seemed much further than it should have been. She bumped her toes around on the dirt floor of the barn to make sure she had a clear place to land. Keeping hold of the wagon until she could grip the top of the stall door, Catherine made her way to the door of the barn and shoved it open. The night was cool and clear, with a heavy spattering of stars against the deep pitch of the sky. They provided enough light for her to see the bushy treetops that surrounded the barn and to just make out several other outbuildings. The breeze lifted the strands that had worked loose from her braid. She might have appreciated a night like this in other circumstances. But wherever the wagon had taken her, she was very far from the train yard. There were no long, low whistles or chugging noises. The shadowy structures around her had roofs and walls instead of smokestacks and coal cars. The only building in sight that seemed to be populated was a large log cabin across the barnyard. She bit her lip to keep her tears from spilling over as she hobbled along, using the split rail fence for a crutch. Her hands inched over the splintery wood grudgingly. Catherine didn't want to go to the house and ask for help. She had no idea who lived in this remote place, or even if they would be willing to assist her. She should have listened to her father. She should have been more careful. Catherine could see the dark window of the second story, glassy against the starlight, but the lower windows were well lit. She kept her focus on them, imagining that someone's kindly old grandma lived there and was baking cookies that she would be happy to share with the stranger on her porch. "Please, please let it be a grandma," she whispered. Quick, soft footsteps sounded behind her, and a moment later she felt something cold and wet pushing into the palm of her hand. She swallowed a shriek at the squelching feeling, relief washing over her as she spotted the big dog trotting along next to her. "Nice puppy," she whispered, extending the hand the dog had nosed. "Please don't bark. I don't want your owners to think I'm out here stealing their chickens." The big dog whuffled at her knuckles for a minute before her tail began beating frantically back and forth. Good girl. Catherine hadn't seen a dog quite so big before, with her shoulders reaching up to the woman's mid-thigh. She had long, droopy ears, soulful eyes, and more skin than she needed. "Do you think you could help me out? It's a long way to the house without any fence. It's bad enough that I have to go up there, but it sure won't help me if I have to crawl the whole way." She couldn't tell what state her dress was in, but there was no point in making it worse. Laying her hand on the dog's shoulders and slowly applying her weight, Catherine was thrilled to see that the canine seemed to understand. The beast plodded slowly along next to her, never getting too far ahead or behind. The dog matched Catherine's pace step for step, watching the human's feet carefully to keep pace. "You really are a good girl," Catherine whispered. "I hope your owners are as nice as you are." The hound led her straight up to the porch, even taking the steps one at a time so that her new friend had plenty of support. When they reached the front door, the dog looked up at her with expressive and questioning eyes as though asking what to do next. Nothing left but to knock, right? She raised her fist, still keeping one hand on the dog, and knocked with the last bit of strength she had left. Chapter 7. I don't know what it is about a late supper that always makes me want to eat more. Jed took another helping of mashed potatoes and piled them onto his plate. It's because you're tired, his wife explained. Your body is trying to make up for how little energy you have. Jed poured a lake of gravy over his potatoes. At this point, I should be able to work all night. What do you say, John? Want to head out to the barn and catch up on everything we're behind on? John sulked over his roast beef, not in the least energized by the meal. He wanted nothing more than to get through his time at the dining table and climb the stairs to his bed. I think I've had enough excitement for one day. If you say so. Josiah piped up around a mouthful of potatoes. I think you're doing your best to stay away from any excitement. Don't talk with your mouth full, Abby admonished. John glared at his brother and picked at his peas. In a way, he would have liked to tell Josiah about the strange girl and how much she had upset him. It would have been nice to get someone else's take on the situation and see if he was overreacting. But Josiah wasn't serious enough for such subject matter, and Jed would just try to impart some older brother wisdom that he didn't want to hear. Joshua, a quiet man who spent more time observing than talking and who was married now, might have something good to say on the subject. But he and Beth were in their own house, likely fast asleep. Jonathan was off on the other side of the property in his hunting cabin, and Judah would just search for the answer in a book. Maybe he would talk to Abby later. Maybe he would talk to Abby lady. I think we all might deserve to sleep in a little bit in the morning, Abby volunteered. She shoveled her food down as fast as was polite before the baby woke up again. I adored the wedding, but I admit I'm tired as well. As long as it isn't too late, Jed replied. We should have some calves dropping soon, and... He stopped mid-sentence and set down his fork. Did you hear something? The rushers all paused in their meal, listening intently. John and his siblings were used to such things on the farm. If the rooster crowed at the wrong time of the day, it meant a skunk or a raccoon had gotten into the henhouse. If the horses were neighing in the barn, then Thunderbolt had kicked through the wall again. There was always a clue if something unusual was happening, and an odd noise at night meant everyone had to be ready to spring into action. But the only thing John heard was the gentle ticking of the mantel clock and his own breathing. What did you hear? He asked softly. Jed shook his head and tucked back into his meal. I swore I heard the barn door opening. Thunderbolt hasn't figured out how to operate the latch yet. At least I hope not. The rest of the family chuckled, and it pleased John that he had managed to inject a little bit of humor into the evening. It was something he would have thought impossible at that point. Besides, if there was something going on in the barnyard, Lucy would have let us know. The family listened once more for the baying of the family hound dog, but when it didn't come, they resumed their meal. I'm probably just hearing things, Jed admitted. It is getting late. A sudden knock on the door had them all out of their chairs. What the... Who's coming at this hour? I knew I heard something. Jed, as the leader of the family, gestured with his hand for the rest of them to get behind him while he opened the door. He swung it open quickly, so as not to give any advantage for whoever might come knocking. It wouldn't be the first time they'd had an angry gathering outside their front door at night, but John thought for sure they would have heard them coming up the road. Still, He moved over to the gun rack in the living room, ready to arm himself if necessary. But the woman standing on the porch was definitely not an angry gathering. John took his hands off the nearest rifle as he looked her over. She had long auburn hair that fell down past her shoulders, hanging in tangled messes that had once been braids. Her freckled face was all too familiar, even though she now had dirt smudged across her cheeks and tears in her eyes. Lucy was at her side, leaning heavily into the stranger. Can I help you?" Jed asked uncertainly. The young lady's eyes landed instantly on John and widened in shock for a moment before she looked up at Jed. Her fingers knitted themselves together in front of her, shook out, and tangled up again. "I don't really know. I don't quite know how I got here, or even where here is, and... Oh, I'm so sorry." The tears flooded down her cheeks now, and she covered her face with her hands. Abby rushed forward to put her arm around the girl and pull her into the house despite the confused look from her husband. There, now, everything will be all right. I promise you're safe. Come sit over here by the fire and you can tell me what happened." John hung back, stunned. He'd had this woman on his mind all evening, and the image of her there on the threshold was so strange that he at first thought perhaps he had fallen asleep at the table and dreamed her up. But he was very much awake now, and she was definitely real. She also looked much worse for the wear. He pushed his glasses up nervously. As Abby drew her forward, the girl nearly fell over. She grasped desperately for the doorway, and Jed swooped in to catch her. "Are you injured?" Jed asked, looking for any sign of blood. "No. Yes. I mean, I only have one leg." She gestured down at her feet in frustration. "Oh no," Abby exclaimed, clamping one hand over her mouth in horror. "What happened to you?" "Jed, we need to get a doctor out here at once." The girl fluttered her hands at them desperately. No. It's a very old injury. It happened when I was a little girl. I just lost my wooden leg, that's all." With a jolt, John realized he knew exactly where it was. The wooden leg they had found in front of the general store must have belonged to her. He only wished he had looked at the shoe that was surely attached to it. If he had noticed a woman's shoe, he probably would have been more concerned about finding its owner. But he had been tired and uninterested, eager to get home and forget about the entire day, and now someone had suffered for it. "But how did you get all the way up here without it?" Jed asked. "No, come in first. Sit down. Let me get you a cup of tea." Abby and Jed helped her to the most comfortable chair near the hearth, and Abby had a mug of tea in the woman's hands in an instant. Lucy followed the girl inside and curled up at her feet. "Thank you so much." The girl took the cup gratefully, wrapping her fingers around the ceramic as though she had never felt anything quite so warm. "I'm so sorry for intruding on you. I'm only just putting the pieces together myself as to how I got here, wherever here is." "You're on the Rusher farm." "Just a few miles north of Woodland, California," Jed replied steadily. His dark eyes watched her with curiosity and just a hint of suspicion. "Does that sound familiar to you?" The girl's eyes brightened. "Woodland, yes. I do know that name. That was the town my father and I had just arrived in this afternoon." She suddenly looked doubtful again. "I think it was this afternoon. I'm afraid I've lost track of all time." "What's your name?" Abby asked gently. "Catherine. Catherine Langer." This part she said with confidence, her head bobbing and the snagged braids rubbing against the back of her dress. Every bit of air rushed out of John's lungs, and he sat down on the sofa with a thud. Fortunately, the rest of the family was too busy to notice, but the events of the afternoon suddenly made so much sense that it hurt. The girl was a Langer, as in Langer engines. Of course, she knew more about trains than he did. Of course, she would happen to be near the train yard as he was standing there. None of it was as random or odd as he had first imagined. "I certainly don't mind giving you shelter for the night, miss," Jed said patiently, "but I would very much like to know how you got here." John held his breath and waited. He was just as curious, but he wasn't willing to ask. He'd made an idiot out of himself at least once already, and there was no reason to make it worse. "I'm not entirely sure." Catherine's green eyes fell to the floor as she thought. "I know that I was trying to look for something and I needed to get higher up. I got on the side of a wagon, and I guess I must have fallen inside." Jed nodded. "I see. And that happened to be our wagon." "I really am so sorry," Miss Langer insisted. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble." Abby waved away her concerns and refreshed her mug of tea. "Don't you worry about any of that. It's quite all right, and it's just as well that you wound up here. We have plenty of space. You can sleep in John's room." This sent John back to his feet again. "What?" Abby looked at him with innocent eyes. "It only makes sense. Now that Joshua has moved to his own house and Jonathan stays at his hunting cabin all the time, you're the only one left in that room. You can sleep down here on the couch. Catherine will have a space to herself with a little bit of privacy." Abby rose and crossed the room to her own bedroom doorway with the authority of one who is not about to be argued with. "I think I have a few dresses that may fit you, Catherine. I'll fetch them so we can get you cleaned up." But she," John spluttered, trying to come up with a good reason why they shouldn't let the Langer girl stay, or at least why she couldn't stay in his room. By the time Abby emerged with a stack of clean linens and 2 gowns in her arms, he still hadn't come up with any decent excuses. Instead, he watched as Jed carried the girl up the stairs to his room. How could this possibly have happened? How could this woman, this girl who had haunted his thoughts all evening, suddenly show up at his door and have the pity and understanding of his family? Without even trying, she had one-upped him twice in one day. Frustrated, he stomped into the kitchen to get some tea for himself. John was a smart man. Sure, he had been wrong about that one fact, but that didn't mean that everything else he knew was wrong. He studied, he read, and he experimented. He was good at what he did, and he had made some excellent improvements around the Rusher farm. So why had this woman made him suddenly so doubtful and hesitant? And he was the kind of man who saw problems that nobody else saw, and managed to fix them. It should have been the same with Catherine. John should have noticed that she only had one leg when he had first seen her. He should have figured out who she was and who her father was. The wooden leg in front of the general store should have given him a big clue, even if he had missed the others. Once the girl had shown up at his house, he should have stepped forward, introduced himself properly, and been the one to take charge of the situation. He wouldn't have put Catherine in his own room, but he would have figured out something. And it definitely would have been better than having that strange woman sleeping in his bed. Jed came stomping back down the stairs once the woman was safely ensconced in John's room and followed him into the kitchen. That's really something, isn't it? He scrounged around in the back of one of the cupboards to see if Abby still had any cookies or pies tucked away anywhere. He had been eating well since he had gotten married, and the slight paunch of his belly showed it. Yeah, I guess you could say that. John stared down into the dark swirl of the tea in his mug, watching the steam rise off the surface. The eldest rusher came out of the cabinet empty-handed. But he smirked at John. "What's wrong? I would think you'd be happy that you finally have a woman in your bed." John glared at him from the side. "I can't say that I am. At least, not that one." "You know her?" With a shrug, John attempted to explain his earlier conversation with Catherine. "Not really. We met briefly near the train yard, and it didn't go well." "What were you doing to her?" Jed asked with a laugh. "Did you try to teach her about trains or something?" John scratched the back of his neck nervously. "Maybe." "I hope you didn't already know whose daughter she was." Jed crossed the kitchen and peered in a different cupboard. "I can't say that I know everything about women, John, but I don't imagine that most of them want to hear the ins and outs about how a train works. Not even women like Catherine." "Yeah, well, I guess I figured that out now. I made an idiot out of myself, and then she shows up on our farm. What am I supposed to do with that?" He still couldn't get over the way she had looked at him when she had shown up at the door. Catherine hadn't been as dressed up as the wedding guests, but she had still been neat and tidy. Once she had taken a spill into the wagon and woken up in the barn, she was as tattered as he had ever seen a woman look. And the only thing he had done was stand there, looking and feeling stupid. "Why didn't you say anything to her?" Jed poked his head out the kitchen door and looked to the stairs, making sure the women hadn't come back down. She probably would have been happy to have a familiar face around, even if she'd only met you for a minute. "She saw me," John assured him. "I know she did, and if she cared to talk to me again, she probably would have said so. No, she already knows that I'm a fool. If anything, I bet she'll be thrilled to get out of here tomorrow and get away from me." He tried to take a sip of his tea, but it was too hot still. In fact, she's probably up there right now telling Abby that she doesn't want to sleep in my bed because some of my stupidity might rub off on her. Jed shook his head, his brown eyes soft as he looked at his brother. "You should give her a little credit. Just because she's the daughter of a railroad baron doesn't mean she thinks she's too good for you. Catherine seems sweet, but she's been through an awful lot today. An awful lot in a lifetime, if you take the leg into consideration." "Now, wait a minute." Jed's gaze was suddenly scrutinizing. "Is that what's turning you off on her? The leg?" "No, no." John put his free hand up defensively. "I didn't even notice it before. We were standing still while we were talking, and I was the one who walked away. It wasn't until she showed up here that I found out." "Well, okay." Jed nodded, but he still looked unsure. "I hope not. She has a pretty face, and her kind demeanor is even more attractive. You could do much worse than a girl like that." "I'm sure you're right, but I'd have to be looking for one first. Besides, nobody said she was interested in me." John's jaw tightened at the thought of marriage. Why was everyone so desperate for him to settle down all of a sudden? Jed nodded. "If you say so. I'm going to bed. I'll see you in the morning, but not too early." He retreated to the master bedroom on the other side of the house, leaving the kitchen feeling far too quiet. With nothing better to do, John went out into the living room and tried to make himself comfortable on the couch. He set his boots near the fire, where they would be nice and toasty the next morning, and pulled a blanket over himself. But he could hear the faint noises of the women upstairs as Abby helped Catherine get cleaned up, changed, and into bed for the night. They were small noises. A scuffle here, a scrape of a chair there, a scrape of a chair there, but they sounded as loud as gunfire inside his skull. He rolled to his other side, his face away from the flickering light of the fire, and forced his eyes shut. but his brain was buzzing with thoughts and questions. Jed said he could do worse than a girl like Catherine. Maybe he was right. She was pretty, with that dark red hair and those bright green eyes. Her leg must not have stopped her much if she had managed to travel all the way out to California. And, of course, she was smart. John needed a woman like that. He didn't want to have a wife who did nothing but bake cookies and sweep the floor, who couldn't keep up her side of an intelligent conversation. He wanted to talk about building and inventing things, and it would be an eternal frustration to have a wife who didn't want to listen. John let his imagination run away with him, envisioning what life would be like if he and Catherine were an item. It was easy enough to picture waking up next to her every morning and discussing what they would be doing for the day over breakfast. But she was, after all, a wealthy heiress. Would she consent to living on a remote farm with him and his brothers? Or would she insist on continuing her travels? A girl who had practically lived her entire life. Traveling around the country might not be content with standing still. And would she even be happy, living a domesticated life? Or was she the kind of woman who had servants and cooks to take care of her? John chided himself. Of course she was. But he didn't have the kind of money to support a lady like that, and it wouldn't be right for him to live off of her riches. Maybe Mr. Longer would offer John a job with the railroad, and he and Catherine could travel together. Perhaps the idea of being with Catherine was even more complicated than he had originally thought. As he drifted into the lighter stages of sleep, he allowed himself to imagine a life where it wouldn't be so difficult. They would sit by the fire, looking through his books about physics and engineering, Catherine pointing out the elements John didn't think about. She would be practical, charming, and warm, her auburn hair falling in waves down her shoulders once she had taken it down for the day. In his fantasy, he didn't need to worry about money or where they would live. They could simply be together enjoying a mutual interest. Abby came down the stairs just before he drifted off completely. She paused as she passed by the sofa to pull the blanket a little further up around John's shoulders. Catherine said to tell you good night, she whispered before padding off to her own room. Suddenly, John was wide awake again. Chapter 8. Waking up should have been a much more pleasant experience this time. Catherine's eyelids fluttered open to find sunlight streaming in through the window and warming the room. She had plenty of blankets piled on top of her, and she knew that she was safe. If she had to fall into a wagon and hit her head, she was glad it was the rusher's wagon. She wasn't surrounded by barn walls, but the plaster and wood walls that were around her were still covered in tools. So was the dresser, and several gadgets and books had been piled on a set of shelves in the corner. Any other time, Catherine would have been curious about them and their owner. Clearly this room belonged to someone who liked to tinker. She had done a little bit of tinkering herself, although not nearly as much as her father, and she enjoyed the feeling of building something new. But she had no interest in looking through the gadgets or the tools that had helped build them. Even though the room was warm and the quilts on the bed were thick, a persistent chill chased itself up and down Catherine's spine. It extended out to her fingertips and toes, snow and ice running through her veins. She curled up into a ball on the bed and rubbed at her foot, hoping to bring some sort of warmth back into her body, but it didn't help. The man whose room this was, John, she was sure Abby had said, was familiar. Catherine's head ached from knocking it against the inside of the wagon, and it seemed as though a lot of time had passed since her conversation with him the previous afternoon, but she was almost completely certain he was the same young man she had tried to speak to at the train yard. He had looked different in the light of the fire, his face stunned instead of transfixed. When she had spotted him there in the living room, a surge of hope had risen in her chest that she might not be among complete strangers. But John hadn't stepped forward to talk to her, and the older man had taken charge of the situation. Catherine hoped she would at least get a chance to talk to John before she left. She had to know for certain. A soft knock came at the door. It was Abby with a loaded breakfast tray. Her hair was carefully braided at the back of her neck, and her glowing face showed no signs of the late night. "I hope you slept well," she said with a smile as she entered. "I hated to disturb you, but I was sure you would be hungry by now. Are you all right?" Her brow wrinkled with concern as she looked at her guest. "I'm terribly cold," Catherine admitted. "I don't know what's wrong with me." Abby set the tray on the dresser and rushed forward to press a cool hand to Catherine's forehead. Her lips compressed in concern. "You have a fever, dear. You probably caught a chill from all that time out in the barn, and it's made you sick. I brought some hot tea with your breakfast, and I'll bring up some willow bark in a moment. You just lie right back down, and we'll get you taken care of. But my father, I'm sure he's worried sick about me. I was supposed to be at the hotel for supper, and I never showed up last night." Catherine could have kicked herself for not bringing up the subject when she had come to the house, but she had been so confused and distraught that she wasn't quite herself. She had been just grateful to get warmed up. Her hostess put a finger to her lip as she thought, "Perhaps you could write a note to let him know what happened. I can send one of the boys into town to deliver it. That way he'll know you're safe, but we won't have to worry about taking you into town too soon. I don't want you loaded back into a wagon if you have a fever." "Oh, I couldn't impose on you any longer." "You've been so kind, really, but I feel terrible for having intruded on your home. And I'm sure John wants his bed back." Catherine tried to get out from under the covers, but they were so heavy she could barely lift them off her. Abby pushed her gently back down against the pillow. "Nonsense. You aren't imposing at all. You had a terrible accident and you need some time to recover. That's all. I'll send one of the men to fetch you when you've finished eating, and I'll get you some paper to write to your father. It won't take any time at all for someone to take it into town and find him." Abby smiled, but her words were firm. Catherine nodded and obediently tucked into her breakfast as best she could. Her body didn't seem to want to warm up despite the hot tea and delicious food. Hopefully she would get better and get back into town sooner than later. She worried for her father, and he was ready to have her wooden leg back. Frowning, Catherine shifted in the bed and thought about the prosthesis. It was clunky, awkward, and it didn't fit quite right, and yet she felt incredibly self-conscious without it. As a little girl, once she had recovered from the accident, she had been happy to skip around with just the one remaining leg that still belonged to her. Being young enough to compensate for the injury, she had quickly learned to balance on one foot or hop up and down the stairs, and that was good enough. But her father had insisted that she wear a false leg to better fit in with other children her age. "You'll get to wear both of your shoes, see?" Papa had said, buckling a dress shoe onto a wooden leg before giving it to her. Won't that be nice? But little Catherine hadn't found it to be nice at all. It had taken a long time to get used to the first prosthesis, and for several weeks it did nothing but drag behind her and get caught on the threshold. "Keep trying," Papa had encouraged. "I know you can do it." Catherine grimaced as she finished the toast Abby had brought and recalled how supportive and kind her father had always been. He had felt that he was doing the right thing, and Catherine understood his motives. If she learned to walk around easily with her new leg, then people would get a chance to know her before they rejected her for her injury. But they had yet to find an artificial limb that didn't give her a horrid limp or fit well enough not to be more of a pain than a blessing. When she had attempted to enter school, little Catherine had been so hopeful. "I can't wait, Papa," she had exclaimed that morning over breakfast. There will be so many other children, and we'll get to play together." Papa had nodded and smiled, but even as a child she had seen a sadness behind his eyes. Catherine had quickly come to understand it when her shoe came off her leg at recess. "Peg leg, the other students had chanted. She never went back to that school. With a sudden sense of determination, Catherine threw back the covers and swung her foot out. A wave of dizziness sent her reeling, but she waited patiently on the edge of the bed for it to pass. Jed had been kind enough to carry her up the stairs, and Abby had promised someone would bring her back down again. But she was tired having people help her all the time. She had once been a little girl who hadn't let a missing leg stop her. So why should it as a woman? Her skin burned from the fever, making even the soft gown Abby had lent her feel scratchy. But she had to get down the stairs to write that letter. Her father needed to know where she was as soon as possible, and there was no reason she couldn't go ahead and get it done. Hopping to the door, Catherine peeked out into the upstairs hallway. Nobody was in sight, and she only heard a few faint noises throughout the house. Hopefully, there wouldn't be too many people around to see her efforts. Keeping her hand on the wall for balance, Catherine maneuvered her way to the top of the stairs and gripped the rail. It had been many years since she had attempted such a thing without a wooden leg. The leather straps that held it to the remnant of her own leg had never been quite secure enough, but at least it had been one more contact point for her to balance on while performing such a stunt. Still, she had done it as a child. Sometimes she had even hopped down the stairs without holding on to the rail, a trick that had terrified her father. There was no reason she couldn't do it now with one leg and a solid banister. The first step was the hardest, with the steep staircase sweeping away from underneath her at a terrifying angle. But her bare foot gripped the floorboards well, and the railing bore her weight with ease. She carefully made her way off the landing and onto the first step, pausing for a moment to catch her breath and calm her pounding heart before attempting the second step, and then the third. By the time she made it almost to the bottom of the stairs, she was smiling. The fever still burned underneath her skin, and she knew that Abby had been correct in making her stay on the farm, but she had achieved something she hadn't imagined she would ever do again. Catherine would need her wooden leg back for going out in public, but the Rusher family had already seen her without it. A door opened and closed at the back of the house, behind her, and a voice called across the big room, "Oh no, you shouldn't be doing that. Let me help you." John was at her side in a moment, boldly putting his arm around her waist to assist her down the last several steps. Catherine opened her mouth to tell him that she was all right, that she had made it down all those other steps without him, and she certainly didn't need him now that she was nearly at the bottom, but the only thing that came out was, "Thank you." His face was riddled with concern. His eyebrows crinkled at the center of his forehead, and his green eyes wide. They were rimmed with dark circles, no doubt from having slept on the couch the night before, and his glasses had slipped to the end of his nose. John's arm was strong as he helped her down the remaining stairs, barely letting her do any of the work herself. "I'm sorry I wasn't in earlier. Abby asked me to come in and help you get down here, but I was trying to finish up with the cattle before I did." He looked down at the floor and scratched the back of his neck. "I shouldn't have made you wait." It's fine, really. Catherine studied this man in a new light. The day before, he had simply been a stranger in the train yard, but now she knew where he lived, who his family was, and even what his bedroom looked like. She had peeked into his world, seeing all the devices he had been building, the others he was fixing, and the books he had read about them. Even the screws, gears, and bits of broken wood and metal that had been scattered throughout his room had said something about the man. "Here, Let me help you over to the desk." Abby said you needed to write a letter. The warm, strong arm went around her waist again and helped her to the wooden chair. He flicked open a drawer and pulled out a sheet of paper and a fountain pen. "There you go." "Thank you." Catherine couldn't imagine how she was going to explain this to her father. It was all so crazy, and she barely believed it herself. Still, she forced herself to uncap the pen and begin. But John was watching her intensely. He had come around to the front of the desk where he could see her without looking over her shoulder. "I spoke to you at the train yard yesterday, didn't I?" she asked. It had to be brought up at some point, and it was just as well to do it when nobody else was in the room. The soft sounds in the kitchen suggested Abby was secluded there, and Catherine could only assume the other men were off doing their chores for the day. John's face turned crimson, and his hand went to his neck again. "Yes, I'm sorry for that." Catherine bit her lip and touched the pen to the paper to avoid looking at him. She hadn't meant to embarrass him, neither then or the day before. Dearest Papa, what should you be sorry for? The only thing he had really done was to stomp away angrily, but Catherine had been through enough in the last day that she had already forgiven him for that. I was rude," he replied softly. "I assumed that I knew more about trains than you did. To be fair, I had no idea who you were at the time. But I shouldn't have assumed that you didn't know what you were talking about just because you're a woman. Please know that I am safe." And who am I? She was going to try his patience, she knew, and perhaps it wasn't the kindest way to treat him. But she had to know if he really did understand who she was. It always changed what people thought of her. Well, I assume you're Fred Langer's daughter." The train magnate. He slowly paced the floor several feet in front of the desk, his hands gesturing wildly even though his words didn't demand it. And does that change anything? She knew that her father had plenty of money, and people treated them differently because of it. Some used it to their advantage, trying to get on the Langers' good side, to extract some sort of reward from them. Some were too in awe to say anything. Some avoided them altogether, believing them to be rich snobs. How would it change John? "I'm so sorry if I made you worry." Of course it does. John's exclamation made her look up in surprise. He had run his hand up through the back of his hair, leaving it sticking out in places. "I mean, you grew up around trains. You probably know everything about them. You were probably born knowing everything about them, and I was foolish enough not to realize that. My knowledge from a book can never compare with your experience." Catherine turned her face back to her note, a smile playing on her lips. Of all the things he could have said, she hadn't expected that one. John respected her because of her knowledge, not her money or status. It was a pleasant surprise. "The Rushers have promised to return me to you just as soon as I'm well enough to travel. It's fine, really. It was nice to have a conversation with someone who didn't know me. But okay." John dropped the argument and parked himself in a nearby chair for a moment while Catherine wrote. She watched him out of the corner of her eye. He was seated, but every muscle in his body was tensed. John had stopped arguing, but his mind was still swirling. Love, Catherine. What are you thinking about? His green eyes met hers for a moment before bouncing away to look out the window. Do you really want to know? Of course. She was enjoying the banter with this man, and it made her forget for a moment that she was ill. He was just a little wild, but not scary. She had met many men before with similar mindsets who worked for her father. They always had enough going on in their brains that it made them seem a little different than the rest of the crowd. Catherine liked different. I'd like to know, he paused uncertainly. Before continuing, more about your prosthetic leg. When she didn't answer right away, he turned back to her and spoke in a rush. "I'm sorry. I know that's so rude of me, and I was just apologizing for being rude. But I wanted to be honest with you, and I really am quite curious. I only got a glimpse at the thing last night, and I wanted to know more about how they work or how they're designed. Most of all, I want to know about the improvements that could be made." The bubble of laughter that rose up in her throat and escaped her lips was a surprise to both of them. "You know, I don't think I've had anyone outright ask me about it since I was a child. It's a subject that everyone avoids, even though it's obvious that everyone knows about it. The only people that ever mention it are my father or my doctors. It's nice to have someone be so frank." He looked doubtful, but his eyes glimmered with hope. "Not at all," she assured him. "How about this? You take this letter to my father for me. He needs to know where I am and that I'm safe. I imagine he has my prosthesis with him, and you can bring it back for me. Then you can examine it all you want." It seemed so silly to be suggesting such a thing, but nothing that had happened since she had arrived in Woodland made sense anyway. John snatched the folded letter out of her hands and headed for the door. "I'll be back as soon as I can." "I promise." He opened his mouth as though to say something more, but he shut the door instead. Abby emerged from the kitchen, flour dusting the front of her apron and baby on her hip. "Did John get you all taken care of?" Catherine smiled. "He did." Chapter 9. John saddled his horse as quickly as he could, the letter Catherine had written burning in his back pocket. He had to get to Mr. Langer fast, and the sooner he got back to the farm, the sooner he would be able to speak to Catherine again. She was a fascinating woman, strong, independent, and smart. He'd never met anyone like her before, and he was eager to get back before she had to leave the farm. With a jolt, he realized just who he was going into town to meet. Fred Langer was a genius, one of his idols. John would not just be doing a favor for a lovely woman, but meeting the man he had looked up to for years. Things couldn't get much better. The wind whipped through his hair as he guided the horse swiftly down the hill toward town. He hoped that there would be some sort of upgrade he could do on Catherine's wooden leg. He wanted a chance to make up for his blunder at the train yard and impress her with his technical skills. What he had said to Jed and Abby was no longer true, but he wouldn't admit it out loud. Maybe he was interested in a wife. The key was finding the right one, as Abby had said, and he may just have done that. When he arrived in town, he was surprised to see the sleepy roads of Woodland alive with a crowd. John slowed his mount and bent to ask a man standing nearby what was going on. The man was milling around the edge of the crowd, waiting for something to happen. He had a long handlebar mustache, and he turned droopy eyes up at John to answer his question. "There's a missing girl, and the deputy is gathering up a crowd to help look for her. She was last seen yesterday afternoon." John swallowed, worrying for the worst. "Who is she? Maybe I can help." The note from Catherine was suddenly thick and uncomfortable in his back pocket. The mustached man looked up at him. "You know, Fred Langer, the railroad man. It's his daughter. He says they arrived in town yesterday, and he sent her on to the hotel. She never showed up, according to the clerk, and nobody else recalls seeing her." He ran a calloused hand through his facial hair. "She'd be pretty easy to spot, too." "The man says she only has one leg." John's blood was now pumping hard enough that he thought it might push his eyes right out of their sockets. It was an effort to try to sound casual. "Is that so?" "Yep. If you want to join the search party, you'll have to speak to Deputy Gaines. He's in front of the courthouse." John nodded his thanks and pushed his way through the crowd, searching for the big red-headed man who served as Woodland's favorite deputy. The throng that had assembled was a large one, with men and women alike in the streets, ready to help. Soon enough, John discovered why Fred Langer himself was speaking on the courthouse steps. It should have been thrilling to see such a man in person. John had read all about Mr. Langer, the numerous trains he had built, and how he was constantly striving to improve both the engines and the cars. It was said that he was a very kind man, in addition to being brilliant and rich, and he often donated money to various charities around the country. Standing on the steps of the courthouse, Fred Langer looked every bit the part he played. His suit was well-fitted and expensive, and the gold pocket watch chain attached to one of the buttons suggested that he had no problem spending his money. John had also heard, however, that the magnate was not the kind to let people take advantage of him. "I'm happy to offer a generous reward for information that leads to the return of my beloved Catherine," Fred was saying, his thumbs tucked into the pockets of his suit jacket and his generous mustache flapping. "She means everything to me, and I can't tell you folks how moved I am to see so many of you volunteer to help find her. I will be sure to show you my appreciation." The crowd responded with a few cheers of encouragement. However, Mr. Langer continued, "Let it be known that I will not tolerate the filthy criminal who has abducted my daughter. I don't take such things lightly, and I will do everything in my power to make certain he hangs from the nearest noose." "Hear, hear!" shouted a large man in the crowd. "We don't let this kind of thing happen in our town, Mr. Langer." "We'll find him, and we'll bring him back to the courthouse no matter what it takes," called another. A woman with an angry face and her fist in the air was next. "We wouldn't want it to happen to our daughters, and we don't want it to happen to yours." Mr. Langer beamed at the support, but he held out his hand, palms down, to settle the crowd. He was used to public speaking, and he looked far more comfortable in front of the crowd than even the mayor did. "It is my sincere hope that with the assistance of Deputy Gaines, we can have a well-organized search party that will return Catherine in short order, safe and sound." He stepped back and let the deputy take his place. Immediately, the townsfolk began shouting out suggestions. "I'll lead a group over in Thompson's Woods." "We should check every single business in town, just in case. And the homes as well." Deputy Gaines waited patiently for the uproar to settle itself. "I have already tapped those who I believe will be the best for leading the search parties, and I've assigned them areas to check. Please be polite, and don't do anything to cause more trouble than we already have. I expect all group leaders to report back to me in 4 hours, no matter whether you found anything or not." He dispersed the crowd with a wave of his hand and stepped down. John dismounted his horse in a state of horror at the turmoil that Catherine's disappearance had caused. He knew exactly where she was, that she was safe, and that the search parties were wasting their time. There was no way that anybody would even be sent out to the Rusher farm to look for her. It was too far outside city limits. He approached Deputy Gaines warily. "This is quite the commotion, isn't it?" Gaines was watching the crowd form groups and disseminate as he had commanded. "It is, but I hope to have it all solved in no time. Maybe the girl just wandered off and got lost somewhere." John knew that Catherine was too smart for that, but the lawman didn't know her from any other girl. "So you don't think she was kidnapped?" he asked hopefully. The big man shrugged and combed his fingers through his walrus mustache. "No telling, really. But I suppose it wouldn't be the first time it happened around here. He eyed John warily. Gulping, John knew exactly what he was talking about. His brother, Joshua, had married Beth only a few minutes after she had gotten off the train in Woodland. Unfortunately, she had been promised to another man. The whole thing had been a misunderstanding, but it had ended with a mob of angry men on the Rushers' doorstep. John and his brothers knew almost everyone in town, but some were still a little suspicious of them. A house with 7 men was bound to get a little rowdy, and they had caused their fair share of trouble. John was a reasonable man, and he would have liked to think he could explain it all to Deputy Gaines. But the look in the red-headed man's eyes suggested that he wasn't going to fall for a story from a rusher, not even with a note to back it up. Anyone could have written it. No, John would have to find some other way to return Catherine to her father. Feel free to join one of the search parties, the lawman suggested. We'll be out around the clock until Catherine Longer is found. You and your brothers would make a welcome addition to the search. Thank you. But they didn't come to town with me. I might do that a little later. I have some errands to run first. John headed toward the general store, trying to think of something he could buy. He couldn't turn around and leave town once he had found out about the missing Catherine. It would make him look suspicious. As much as he wanted to run home and fetch the girl, fever or not, he would have to bide his time for a little bit. As he stepped up to the door of the general store, he noted that Catherine's wooden leg was no longer lodged in the boardwalk in front of the building. The store was bustling with activity, and Monroe strove to keep up with the demand as best he could. Apparently, those who had turned out to hunt for the missing girl had brought their wives and families with them as well, and everyone was taking advantage of their time downtown. He waited near the door, looking for a path to the counter, while women gossiped with each other and decided what to buy. "What do you think of this whole thing, Susan?" A woman in a white hat asked her friend, her fingertips pressed to her bodice in astonishment. "I just can't believe it. You don't think these sorts of things will happen in a small town like this, and then they do." Her friend, who kept her dark hair bundled up under a blue hat covered with flowers, bobbed her head in agreement. "I know, but she is the daughter of a wealthy man. I bet someone is holding her for ransom somewhere." Her cheeks glowed with the romance of the notion. "I don't know why anyone would want her at all." This interjection came from a woman in a bright yellow dress with numerous frills and ribbons. She was tall and thin, with straight posture and a nose that stayed high in the air. I mean, she only has one leg. How valuable could she be? The other two looked at her in surprise, and then moved off to the other side of the store to prattle in private. This left a clear avenue to the counter, and John gratefully stepped up. "How are things going today, Monroe?" he asked nonchalantly. "Is your son enjoying his marriage?" The clerk gave him a smile as he finished wrapping a package in brown paper. "He is, at least, that's what he tells me. I suppose he might change his mind after a while, but for now he's happy." He chuckled softly. "It was a very nice wedding," John stalled. "Abby was thrilled to come." Monroe tied a piece of twine around the package with deft fingers. "I'll be sure to tell my wife. She spent a lot of time putting it all together. What do you think about all this business with Mr. Langer's daughter?" John could only stand so much wedding talk, and if he was going to spend some time in town, he might as well find out all he could. Monroe shook his head. "I don't like it. If she was kidnapped, then I sure wouldn't want to be the man who did it. Mr. Langer is a formidable man with a lot of money. He can make sure that the criminal gets what he deserves." John pressed his lips together. He had been thinking the same thing. And if the entire town was up in arms and determined to believe Catherine had been abducted, then it wouldn't be an easy thing to change their minds. "I need to buy some envelopes. if you don't mind. And a pen. It wouldn't be such a waste, since the nib on his own pen was nearly worn out anyway. No problem. You want ink as well? Monroe turned to the shelves behind him, which were loaded with various paper goods and a decent selection of pens. Yes, please. Black will be fine. Several minutes later, standing near his horse and keeping an eye out for anyone who might be watching him, John had Catherine's letter secured inside an envelope. He wrote Mr. Langer's name and the address of the hotel on the outside and headed toward the post office. The clerk greeted him with a smile. "Good morning, John. Jed picked up all the mail I had for your place yesterday. What can I do for you?" He held the envelope out and handed it over the counter. "I found this on the ground. Someone must have dropped it." The clerk's mouth pursed in surprise. "That's not good. I'll make sure it gets delivered. Anything else you need?" "That'll do it. Take care." John left the post office feeling guilty. He had promised Catherine he would get the letter to her father. Technically, he was still doing so, but not in the spirit in which he had originally meant. He was supposed to put that note right in the man's hand. And now he had gone through a third party. She wouldn't be pleased with him when she found out. But if she knew the reason, then perhaps she would forgive him once again. If John admitted to anyone that Catherine was at his farm, or even worse, that she had slept in his bed, his meaning would instantly be misconstrued. The people of Woodland were searching for a kidnapper, and they were determined to find one. He just had to make sure he didn't put himself in the way of that until Mr. Langer received the letter via the post office. It would make things a little awkward down the road when everyone realized John had known her whereabouts all along, but it would have to do for now. He stopped at the print shop to pick up a few books for Judah, determined to keep up his pretense having errands to run, before returning to his horse and preparing to head back home. "John? You mind if I have a word with you?" John turned, one foot in the stirrup, to find Deputy Gaines with a posse of men behind him. A chill crept up his shoulders to his neck. "Of course." Gaines fingered his mustache as he spoke. "It's a funny thing, really. Catherine Langer's wooden leg was found in front of the general store early this morning." "Yes, I know. I heard," John stammered. His blood was rushing through his body again. He didn't know where this was going, but it couldn't be good. "I have several witnesses who claim that they saw your wagon parked at that exact same spot yesterday during the wedding. Care to explain that to me?" The lawman kept his hands at his waist, his thumbs tucked into his belt. He wasn't reaching for his gun or his handcuffs, but he was watching John carefully. John rapidly considered his options. There was no point in running. It would only make him look guilty, and he would never get out of town before someone caught up to him. He could deny it, claiming the leg was nothing more than a coincidence. But the truth was going to have to come out at some point. "Well, I should have told you this earlier, but I didn't think it would go over well." "Arrest him. He has her," cried one of the men. "Hush now, and let him talk," Gaines commanded. The posse fell silent once again. "Catherine Langer is at my place. She's perfectly safe, I assure you, Anne." The crowd behind Gaines surged forward, screaming and calling once again for his arrest. Gaines put his arms out to keep them in check, his wide shoulders tensing against the forward momentum of the mob. "I should have known it would be a rusher. Can't trust them. He'll be hanging before sundown. Mr. Langer will still give us the reward money, won't he?" "Get back," Gaines hollered. Once the witnesses settled down, Gaines stepped forward and grasped John by the wrist. He raised one red eyebrow. "I think you'd better come with me. This crowd is going to get out of hand before you know it." John went willingly, dodging a few apples that someone threw at him from a nearby wagon. Hopefully, he would have time to explain everything once they got back to the sheriff's office. Chapter 10. Catherine sat near the fire next to Abby. Beth, the wife of one of the other brothers, had come to the house as well and joined them for some quiet time with needle and thread. Catherine didn't have her embroidery with her, of course, but Abby had plenty of extra supplies to lend her. The hound, Lucy, was curled up at her feet and snoring contentedly. Instead of concentrating on her stitches, Catherine kept her ears tuned to the driveway. She awaited the jingle of a harness, the whinny of a horse, or perhaps even the crunching of wagon wheels if her father had decided to accompany John back to the farm. She heard the fussing of the baby in his cradle, the comings and goings of the numerous other Rusher brothers as they moved through the house, and the lowing of a cow, but nobody came up the driveway. "I'm sure he'll be back soon enough," Abby said comfortingly, reading Catherine's face. "It's a long ride into town, so it isn't a surprise that we haven't seen him yet." Catherine stabbed her needle into the fabric, realized it was in the wrong spot, and pulled it back out again. "You don't think anything would have happened to him?" she hesitated to ask. It sounded selfish, since the Rushers would probably assume she was more concerned about herself than the well-being of John. They wouldn't have been completely right, but it would have been reasonable. "I doubt it," Abby assured her. Her needle, threaded with green floss, flowed confidently in and out of her embroidery hoop. "John is a careful man. He doesn't ride like the devil's chasing him, like some of the others." "I heard that," Josiah called from the other side of the house. "You were supposed to," Abby called back jovially. She reached over and patted Catherine's good knee. "There are any number of possible reasons why he isn't back yet, and they aren't all bad ones. Maybe he is making arrangements to bring your father with him, since you have been ill," suggested Beth. The dark-haired woman spoke fluent English, but had a distinct French accent that made her a delight to listen to no matter what she was saying. Her stomach was round with a coming child, and she waddled slightly when she walked. Catherine wondered if she would ever have the chance to find out how her wooden leg did under the burden of pregnancy. It wouldn't be such a terrible thing to limp around if it was for a good reason like that. I hope you're right. Catherine had a hard time imagining her father bumping around on the seat of a wagon down country roads. He preferred the smooth ride of one of his trains, but of course there were no railroad tracks way out here in the hills. "Speaking of, how are you feeling?" Abby asked. "I have some more willow bark if you need it." Catherine shook her head. "I'm much better, if not completely recovered. I imagine I'll be ready to travel again soon." Yes, she would travel. Once she was reunited with her father, Mr. Langer would spend only a little time in Woodland before it was time to move on to the next stop. Normally, this didn't bother her in the least, but for once she felt the need to stay rooted for a little while. "It is selfish of me, but I hope not," Beth replied. The flowers in her embroidery hoop were sprouting perfect little petals in purples and pinks. "I understand that you've been all over the country, and I would love to hear about all the places you've been." Really? Catherine had imagined that this would be a boring subject matter for farmers' wives. Most of her time had been nothing but train, hotel, suitcase, train, hotel, suitcase, train, hotel, suitcase. "Oh, yes. I am happy here on the farm, but Joshua promises me that we will get to do a little bit of traveling someday. I was born in Chartres, France. My parents immigrated to America when I was just a little girl, and we lived a few different places before moving to New Orleans. Her hands no longer moved as she spoke, too distracted by her previous journey. Her chocolate eyes were distant as she turned to the window. How exciting! I've been to New Orleans a few times. The food there is wonderful, so spicy. Even if she and her father only stayed in any given city for one night, they still had to eat. As a result, Catherine had tasted all sorts of delicious fare, some of which she didn't even know the name. Oh! Beth let her French slip in her excitement. My parents know many French people down there, and some of them are the most amazing cooks. It made me sad to leave, but now I don't think I could ever go back to live. Not now that I've found Joshua. Her dark eyes were dreamy as she stared into the fireplace. And to think I may have even arrived on one of the trains your father built. The mention of trains brought John to the forefront of Catherine's mind once again. Maybe so. I understand that John has quite the interest in trains. That and anything else with moving parts. Abby picked up a new piece of thread and deftly poked it through the eye of her needle. He's quite the inventor, really. Catherine nodded. Yes, I noticed all the equipment in his room. Has he made anything of significance? She concentrated on her needle and missed the look that the other two women exchanged. Well, he devised a way that we could replace the entire roof on this place without having it leak. And then there was the new fence for the cattle so that they couldn't get out anymore. Abby put a finger to her lips. Oh, and he insisted on a rocking mechanism for the baby's cradle. I didn't want to use it, but if I'm honest, it really does come in quite handy. She laughed and shook her head. Don't forget all the work he did on the plans for our house, Beth offered. She turned to Catherine, her needle now lodged idly in her fabric. Joshua is wonderful with his hands, but he needed some help when it came to the layout of the new house. John stepped right in and made it all work beautifully. I think he mentioned a gate opener as well. The baby began to whimper, and Abby stood to fetch him from his cradle. At first, I thought he was just making messes with all of his tools. I still like to tease him about it, but the truth is that I don't know what we would do without him. Every time I turn around, he's making something easier to do or more efficient. That's wonderful. That probably explains why he isn't back yet, then. If John and my father get to talking, they might never stop. Catherine could easily imagine the two of them ignoring the matter at hand in order to discuss the inner workings of some machine. Abby reached toward a shelf near the mantel and retrieved a notebook. The edges were well worn, and several of the pages had been bent at the corners. Here, look at his sketches. I don't know what half of them mean, but it sure makes him look like he knows what he's doing. Catherine took the notebook hesitantly. It felt like looking in someone's private diary. He won't mind. I doubt it. He'll be happy someone was interested enough to look. Abby sat back down and rocked the baby gently. Within the pages of the notebook, Catherine was startled to find intricate drawings and plans. There were diagrams of fences, farming tools, and buildings, each with their current layout and the ideas John had for making them better. Most of the drawings were surrounded by equations where John had worked out the downward force of a roof on its supporting beams or the heat output of a wood stove with a fan. Near the back was a sketch of the gate opener Abby had mentioned. This is incredible. Abby's lips curved into a small smile, and the look in her eyes was soft and knowing. Yes, I just might have to do that. Catherine wondered if there would be a chance for her to speak alone with John once again. It was more likely that she would be whisked off to Woodland and then loaded onto a train without getting to do more than thank the rushers or say goodbye. But she needed to let him know that he was incredibly gifted, and the notebook in her hand proved it. So what if he didn't know every little thing about trains? She had been learning about them her whole life, and it would be nice to hear someone talk about something new for a change. Closing the notebook and handing it back to Abby, Catherine hoped John would come home soon. Chapter 11. The crowd surged against the door of the jail, knocking against the wood and shouting for access to the prisoner. Gaines ignored them, latching the door firmly and escorting John to a cell. "You don't have to do this," John tried to explain. "It's all a misunderstanding. Catherine hasn't been kidnapped. Unfortunately, that isn't up to me to decide." The deputy held open the cell door. "The evidence points at you, and you just said yourself that she's at your place. What other conclusion did you expect anyone to come to?" John walked inside the tiny room reluctantly. "That it was an accident. I promise nothing bad happened to her." Gaines shut the door with a clank and shook his head. "That's a nice idea, and I sure hope that it's true. But you have to admit that you and your brothers haven't always been on your best behavior." "But it was never anything like this," Dawn protested. "Well, nothing like this that actually turned into anything," he corrected, remembering once again the situation with Beth. Joshua had nearly been hung, even though his wife had married him willfully and lawfully. It didn't seem fair that John should have to pay for that incident, even though everyone in Woodland now knew the couple to be quite happy together. "It's up to the judge," Gaines said. "And you better hope it isn't someone under Langer's influence. People of the law aren't supposed to be easily bribed, but you get enough money on the table and some people will do anything." He stomped off toward his desk to do his paperwork. John sat down on the bunk and put his head in his hands. He hadn't committed a crime, and he didn't deserve to be in jail, but there was little he could do about it. By the time Catherine was found and brought back to town, he would probably already be dead. It didn't take long for Mr. Langer himself to show up. John knew it was him before he even approached the cell. He could hear his authoritative voice booming throughout the small building. "I'm here to see the villain who kidnapped my daughter." "Right this way." Gaines approached and gestured at John's cell. "He's right here. Would you like me to let him out so the two of you can talk?" "Absolutely not," Langer boomed. "I don't want to put myself in harm's way, nor do I want to risk him escaping and getting back out into society. Keep him locked up by all means, but I do intend to speak with him for a few minutes." "Suit yourself." Gaines retreated to his desk. John watched the older man as he turned to face him. Despite everything that Mr. Langer believed had happened to his daughter, he still looked fresh and crisp in his suit. Not a hair was out of place on his gray head, nor in his beard, and he spoke with authority to the prisoner. "Young man, tell me right now what you've done with my daughter." This was his one chance to get things straightened out, and he didn't want to botch it. "Mr. Langer, I'm so glad you're here. Let me start by just saying what a big fan I am of yours. Was that your scheme? Get close to me by stealing away my daughter? Well, you certainly got your interview with me, but I promise you that I'll be the one asking the questions." He wagged a pink, meaty finger at John, his face purpling slightly. "No, that's not it at all." John stood up, holding his hands together in front of him, begging the older man to listen. It was all an accident, and nobody was kidnapped. "Are you telling me that she came with you on her own accord? Of her own free will?" His blue eyes were dubious. "Well, no, but—" "Aha! Just listen." John hadn't shouted at anyone for a long time, and he was surprised at the volume of his own voice and how it echoed in the small cell. By the look on Fred Langer's face, so was he. "Listen," he repeated, more calmly this time. "I spoke to Catherine for a few moments near the train yard yesterday, but we went our separate ways after that. When my family and I got home, she came knocking at the door." John explained how the woman had fallen into the wagon and ridden up into the hills with the rushers. "Unconscious. I brought a letter to town to give to you, but I was scared you would accuse me of something terrible. I gave that letter to the post office, and it may very well be waiting for you at the hotel right this minute." Desperation had leaked into his voice, and he wasn't even sure he cared. He just had to get Catherine taken care of and keep his own neck out of the noose. Mr. Langer leaned against the bars of the door. "I would love to believe that, son. I would love to believe that my little girl went traipsing off without a care in the world and just had a little accident. But Catherine is too careful for those kinds of things. You want me to think that just because she's missing a leg that she might be missing part of her brain too?" John fought back the urge to yell at the man once again. Mr. Langer was putting words in his mouth, and they were the kind of words that were only going to get him in more trouble. "You've got to believe me. Just go right on up to the farm and find her. She'll tell you everything herself." "I'll do just that, as soon as I see that rope around your neck," Fred promised. "You know, I travel all over the country and I meet all kinds of people, but I've never met one quite like you. I have a feeling that if things were different, you might be looking at it a different way." John hated that his meeting with Mr. Langer was being wasted on such silly accusations. Meanwhile, Catherine was back at the Rusher farm, having no idea what happened or how to fix it. If she was there at the jail, she could tell her father exactly what happened and clear the whole thing up. "I highly doubt it," the older man retorted. "Do you have any idea what my daughter means to me?" John knew better than to answer. "She's the only thing I have in this world. Sure, I have my trains and plenty of money to go with them, but they don't mean a thing if I don't have Catherine." He sat down heavily on a bench just outside the cell. "When she was born, I thought my life was complete. I had just finished my first engine and had a commission for a second one. We were so excited for what lay ahead of us, but my wife died only a year after that, just after Catherine took her first steps." "I'm very sorry to hear that." John had no clue. All the newspaper clippings and books he had read about the Langers had been focused on the man's work, not his family. John hadn't thought much about his personal life at all until Catherine had come around. "Sure, you are. I bet you don't have a clue what it's like to lose someone. Do you have a wife, children?" The softness in Mr. Langer's voice when he was reminiscing about the past was quickly replaced with an irate sting. John shook his head. "I haven't had the privilege. But I've lost both my mother and my father. I do know something about loss." Fred wasn't eager to give John any points for this. "Well, never mind all that. I still had Catherine, and I still had my trains. The two of us were going to make it just fine." He stared off into the distance as he spoke. "How she loved to follow me around the train yard. I knew it was dangerous, but I kept an eye on her and made sure she was always near me. That way, nothing could happen to her, but she was independent even at that age, and she wandered off while I was inspecting a steam valve. I heard the train coming into the yard, but I had no idea that Catherine was in front of it." A knot formed in John's throat as he envisioned the events before him. A little girl with red pigtails being pinned under a train was not a pleasant thought. "I was lucky that she lived. She fought like a champ, and I was so relieved. But I was so heartbroken to know that all of my knowledge and all of my knowledge and all of my skill couldn't give her a new leg. I was an engineer, not a miracle worker. I paid for the most expensive prosthesis I could find, convinced that I could make it all up to her. He laughed softly, a hank of silver hair falling down over his forehead. She hated that thing. I told her she had to wear it, but she wouldn't listen. I'd find her down by the creek or off in an orchard, her wooden leg lying on the ground like a discarded doll. Mr. Langer, if you're going to the trouble of telling me all this, then you must understand that I'm not the bad guy here. I swear I would never do a thing to hurt Catherine. I don't know her well, but I can see what a wonderful woman she is. John was desperate. There had to be some way to get through to this man. I'm only telling you this because I know you'll be dead soon, and I think you ought to know what a terrible thing it is that you've done. You tell me that Catherine is safe, and I sure hope you're right, but I doubt she would be if the kind folk of this town hadn't caught you. He snarled through the bars at the prisoner. Please, Mr. Langer. Go check with the clerk at the hotel. Catherine wrote a letter to you, and the post office was supposed to deliver it. I'm sure it's there by now, and it will explain everything. Why was it so hard to get anyone to believe him? He'd had his hand in a few brawls, but he'd never done anything so terrible to warrant this kind of treatment. Even if there is, how do I know you haven't made her write it under duress? Langer shook his head and ran a hand over his eyes. I never should have brought her out here. She goes everywhere with me. But a brilliant young lady like her has no business in some frontier backwater like this place. She's too smart. What she lacks in mobility she makes up for in brains. Yes, I could see that. John held his breath, waiting for Langer to assault him again at the idea that he had spent time with Catherine. But he had been able to see, even in just 2 short conversations, that the girl was something special. I came into town to get your daughter back to you, sir. I may not have gone about it the right way, but my intentions were good. Langer's eyes were distant again. You know, I've worked with many different men during my years in the railroad business. Some of them have been wonderful, and others have been terrible, but I've often found that it's the terrible ones who are always trying to tell me how great they are. John closed his eyes and pressed his forehead against the cool wall of his cell. There was no way to get through to this man. He needed to get someone in here who would be on his side. Jed, maybe. Suddenly, Langer stood and turned to face him. I think I've heard enough from you. When you see me next, it'll be at the gallows. He marched out of the jailhouse like a soldier, straight and proud. Gaines. John called. I need to talk to you. He could hear a heavy sigh and the sound of a chair scraping across the floor as the deputy got up from his desk and came to the cell. What is it? He asked, his eyes tired. You've got to help me out. I need to get that note from Catherine. Better yet, I need Catherine herself. She's up at the farm. Langer doesn't believe me. Gaines pinched the top of his nose between his thumb and finger. Look, John, no matter what you say, Langer is going to have his way. He's already called in Judge Murphy, and he's got the man in his pocket. Murphy likes money, and I can't say that things look good for you. John's stomach dropped down into his shoes. That can't be right. What kind of justice is that? The deputy shrugged. The kind that's purchased instead of given. The kind that doesn't really care what's right and wrong because pockets are being lined. It's not how it should be, I know. But there isn't much I can do to change it. Yes, you can, John insisted. I understand that you can't change how Judge Murphy does things, but you can help me get the evidence that will make him change his mind. If Catherine is here and she tells everyone the truth, then there's no way he can still sentence me." The red-headed man shook his head. "I can't promise they'll take her word for it, but I'll see if I can't get a few men to run up there. It's late enough today that Judge Murphy won't be in until the morning, and they don't do the hangings until sundown, so we have a little bit of time. At the very least, we can let your brothers know what's going on." The look in his eyes suggested that he was a little afraid of what the other rushers might do when they found out John was about to be hanged. "Thank you, Deputy. It's the only chance I've got." "Yes," Gaines replied. "I know." Chapter 12. Catherine had spent a second night in John's room, but she hadn't slept for most of it. She felt much better, her fever and chill having abated under Abby's care, and the bed was quite comfortable. But every time she closed her eyes, she could think of nothing but the two people she was most worried about. Had her father received her letter? Did he know that she was safe and sound and ready to return to town just as soon as she possibly could? What must he be doing if he hadn't received the news? And once they were reunited and everything had been settled, would he be angry with her? It was true that falling into the wagon was an accident, but she never should have been climbing on the side of the thing anyway. Nevertheless, she would apologize for making him worry. It was the right thing to do. And what about John? It seemed strange that he hadn't returned yet, no matter how many excuses and assurances Abby had about his absence. If something had happened to him, she would be so angry with herself. She was the one who had gotten them all into this mess in the first place, and it was all because she had been trying to avoid John. Catherine knew she shouldn't have worried about it so much. Emerging from her temporary room, Catherine headed slowly down the stairs for breakfast. She noted that the rushers made a point of not watching her as she navigated the staircase, and she appreciated their discretion. She didn't need the added pressure of having them all watch her descend from the second floor. At the bottom of the stair, leaning against the railing, was a tall stick. It was thick and sturdy and had a thin loop of leather at the top. "What's this?" Abby had been laying dishes out on the dining table for breakfast, but she came forward with a timid smile. "It's a walking stick. We thought it might be helpful for you since your wooden leg isn't here." Catherine picked up the stick, putting the piece of leather around her wrist and trying it out. It wasn't quite as good as even a shoddy prosthesis, but it helped her balance. She took a few steps across the room, finding that she could move across the floor even when there weren't any walls to lean against or furniture to grab. "Thank you." "It's so kind. We know it isn't much, but the only one who might be able to actually make you a new leg would be John." The corners of her mouth turned down ever so slightly as she spoke. "I don't suppose he's made it back yet." Catherine's heart rose, hoping that he had come back sometime in the middle of the night and nobody had awakened her to tell her. But she also knew that what sleep she had gotten was light enough that she would have heard someone coming up the hill. "No, I'm afraid not." For once, Abby looked a little worried. A heavy line ran across her forehead, marring the glowing look of health and happiness that she usually bore. "I'm giving him until noon." Jed volunteered from the table, where he was spreading a napkin on his lap and lifting up a ladle heavy, with gravy. "Then I'm going into town after him. Do you think something's happened?" The tall man shook his head. "Probably not. Knowing him, he got caught up somewhere watching a printing press work. Or maybe trying to tell the poor printer how to improve the process. He's just wandering around somewhere." Catherine frowned slightly. If that was true, then she didn't feel nearly as sorry for sending him out with her letter. "Or his horse threw a shoe," Abby said brightly, in an attempt to make up for her husband's blunder. Either way, they'll make sure he gets back today. Sitting down at the table, Catherine picked at her food. It looked lovely, but it was going to be hard to eat until she knew that both her father and John were safe. After breakfast, Catherine accompanied Abby out to the chicken coop to gather eggs and then to the vegetable garden to harvest a few vegetables for the day's meals. "I've never done work like this before," she explained as she stooped over to pick the tomato Abby had indicated was ripe. "We haven't ever been in one place long enough, and even so, there were always servants. I enjoy it." Abby's words must have been honest, considering the beatific expression she usually wore had returned. "I like having work to do that takes care of my family. Plus, it gets me out of the house for a little bit. There's no better way to start the day than with a little bit of fresh air and sunshine." Catherine straightened and took in a lungful, noting the sweet scents of autumn flowers and ripe vegetables, but she also noticed a flash of movement near the road. "Look!" Abby glanced in the direction her guest pointed for only a moment, before picking up her skirts and running out of the garden and toward the front of the house. "Is it John?" Catherine called from behind her, struggling along with her walking stick. "Oh, I'm sorry." Abby turned back to assist her. Catherine waved her off. She was more concerned about their visitors, who had turned up the long driveway. "That's fine. Can you tell who it is?" Abby shaded her eyes with her hand. "Not quite. There are several men, but I don't see John. I'll get Jed. You wait right here." She disappeared into the barn and emerged a moment later with her husband. He watched the group of riders for a moment and frowned. "Why don't you ladies go in the house?" he said quietly. His tone wasn't one to be argued with. Catherine let her hostess assist her up the porch stairs and into the house, but they both turned and pressed their faces to the window to see what was going on. The group had just entered the barnyard, and they could see now that neither John nor her father were with them. The man at the front wore a deputy's badge on his coat, and it glinted in the morning sun. "What can I do for you?" Jed asked warily. He stood confidently in the barnyard, observing the crowd carefully. Catherine was grateful that the windows weren't thick enough to obscure their words. Otherwise, she would have had to insist on going outside. There was no way she could wait around for any more news. "I'm Deputy McClure. Gaines asked me to come up here." The man was young, with a smooth face, and Catherine guessed that he had not been working for the sheriff's office long. "And what business does Deputy Gaines have here?" Jed took a few steps toward the deputy, the corners of his mouth turning down in concern. "Your brother, John, is currently being held in the county jail for kidnapping. Judge Murphy arrived this morning and has sentenced him to hang this evening." Abby gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. Catherine's eyes widened, and she immediately pushed toward the front door. "No way," Abby insisted. "Let's see what else they have to say first." Catherine didn't like the idea of letting the men handle things. If John was in jail and about to go to the gallows, then plenty had gone wrong already. But she didn't want to upset Abby or Jed, and she knew she could trust Jed to make sure his brother was freed. "And who is it," Jed asked with painful slowness, "that my brother is said to have kidnapped?" "That would be a Catherine Longer. Her father reported her missing the day before yesterday, and the sheriff's office has reason to believe that John is at fault." The frown on Jed's face twisted up slightly into a small smile. "My brother? John? Kidnapping someone?" He shook his head and laughed fully. "I can't ever let my brothers go into town on their own again." Now it was Deputy McClure's turn to look confused. "With all due respect, Mr. Rusher, this isn't a laughing matter. The gallows are being set up as we speak." Jed gestured toward the house with his head. "It is a laughing matter if you know all the information." "I think that's our cue," Abby whispered. "Let's go." She led Catherine out onto the porch. Deputy McClure didn't look surprised. "John told Gaines she would be here, but I'm afraid that only proves his guilt." Catherine stepped forward. She wasn't going to hold back any longer. With the walking stick to lean on, she crossed the porch and came down the steps. She was aware of Abby's eyes on her back, sympathetic and worried. Jed watched her with his muscles tensed, ready to jump forward to catch her if need be. The deputy and his lawman muttered to each other and wrinkled their brows. "I'm Catherine Langer." Her voice was loud and clear, echoing slightly across the barnyard and the surrounding hills. "I'm not being held here against my will. The Rushers have been nothing but kind to me, and they have offered me shelter when I was lost and ill." McClure looked at his men and then back at Catherine. "You're sure?" "Yes, of course. Now get back into town and get him out of jail." Immediately. Catherine was surprised at the authority in her voice. She'd heard her father use such tones with people before, when they weren't working quickly enough to meet a deadline or when someone wasn't following directions. People scrambled into action when he spoke like that, and the posse in front of her now did the same. "Yes, yes, ma'am." Deputy McClure tipped his hat at Catherine, nodded at Jed, and swung his horse around. They took off the way they had come at high speed, leaving a trail of dust in their wake. "Sounds like we better get you back into town," Jed said. The humor he had shown at John's predicament had faded, and Catherine suspected that he had never really found it funny at all. "I'll get the wagon hooked up." "It'll be faster if we ride," Catherine suggested, imagining the slow bumping of a wagon over the dirt roads. But Jed looked at her, then down at her missing leg and back. "Pardon me for asking, but can you ride?" It had been ages. Mr. Langer had purchased a pony for her when she was young, and he had been a peaceful old gelding. Catherine could go out to the paddock without a saddle or bridle, hoist herself onto his back with the assistance of the fence, and ride him around all afternoon. She had done it several times, even after the accident that left her with one leg, but it had scared her father so badly that she soon stopped. Eventually, the old pony had died and Catherine was riding trains when she needed to go somewhere. "I can," she said confidently. Jed hesitated for a moment, watching her. His eyes flicked to Abby, looking for approval, but his wife was watching Catherine as well. "All right," he finally said. "We need to hurry, though. Just because the hanging is set for sundown doesn't mean they'll wait that long, and it will take a while to get into town." "You can take my mare," Abby offered. "She is gentle and comfortable, and she'll go as fast or slow as you'd like her to." She scrambled off to the barn to get the horse ready. Jed left to get his brothers, and Catherine was left alone in the barnyard. She took a moment to take one last glance at the big log cabin, the soaring barn, and the beauty of the pastures and farm fields that surrounded it all. She was going to miss this place. Chapter 13. "Why does this have to take so long?" Mr. Langer demanded. He stood in front of Deputy Gaines, dwarfed by the lawman in size but not intimidated. "This man has stolen my daughter and taken her off into the hills. There's no telling what else he's done. He didn't even have the courtesy to make sure she had her leg with her. I demand justice." Gaines put his hands in the air, his palms toward the older man, hoping to settle him down. I know. I understand. But there are certain things we have to take care of first. If you're waiting on him to eat his last meal, then you might as well give it to poor. It doesn't look like he plans on touching it." John sat in his cell, a plate of food in front of him. As Mr. Langer had pointed out, he hadn't eaten a bite. He was determined not to die, one way or the other, and if somehow he did, he sure wasn't going to let that terrible jail food be his last meal. At the very least, he deserved one of Abby's thick ham steaks, followed by her delicious apple pie. But he couldn't possibly hang for this. He couldn't. He had done nothing wrong. Gaines seemed to believe him, but he had said no more on the subject. John wanted to ask if the deputy had done as he had promised and sent someone to the Rusher farm. But it was best if Langer wasn't in on any of their plans. The man was too powerful, and John didn't know what he might do to stop them. He'd had his chance to run when Gaines had first brought him in. At the time, it had seemed like a bad idea, but he was beginning to reconsider. There was no way of getting out of his cell and getting out of his cell and getting away, but there might be some possibilities for escape once they led him out to the gallows. His throat tightened at the thought. Judge Murphy entered the building. He looked to be about the same age as Fred Langer, with long white hair that he kept combed back. His eyes were pale blue and cloudy, and he only glanced briefly at the prisoner before addressing Mr. Langer. That should do it. All of the official paperwork is taken care of. Good. I can't tell you how much I appreciate what you've done. I'm sure you would want the same thing if it were your daughter. Langer smiled and shook the other man's hand vigorously. Yes, well. The judge suddenly looked uncomfortable. I'm not entirely sure about it. Is the money a problem? I can double it. Wah, now. Gaines stepped into the conversation. I really hope I'm not hearing what I think I'm hearing. I know these things happen, but if I actually have proof of it, then I'm going to have to do something about it. Judge Murphy frowned, and Mr. Langer scowled. I'm just expediting the process, Gaines. Stay out of it. Yes, let's get this thing over with, the judge agreed. Gaines plucked a large ring of keys off the wall and unlocked John's cell. Anything else you need before we do this? He asked quietly. John's eyes burned with anger. He had really thought Gaines was someone he could trust to help him. While the deputy had not outright been at fault for his incarceration and the execution to come, he hadn't done much to stop it. I don't suppose we could at least wait until my brother gets here. Gaines took a deep breath and blew it out between his lips. What do you think, Judge? Can we stall just a little while longer? Let him see his family one last time? Since when do convicted criminals have such privileges? Mr. Langer barked. I didn't get to see my daughter one last time, and it only seems fair that he should get the same treatment. The deputy held open the cell door, and John's feet dragged as he emerged. Even being in jail was better than dying, especially when they had no real reason to hang him. The jailhouse was right near the square, and the gallows were waiting for him in the center. A crowd had formed to watch. John heard angry shouts and expressions of shame. Hang him. Make an example out of him. It's a pity, really. He could have been a good man. We need to get the rest of the rushers after this. John kept his focus on the loop of rope that awaited him. It was so barbaric, so old-fashioned. Surely there was some way to improve upon it, to make it quicker and more humane. He shook his head at himself for thinking that way even as he was about to die. He slowly climbed the wooden stairs, tuning out the shouts from the crowd and concentrating on thoughts of his family. Jed had been a wonderful brother to raise all 6 of them once their parents had died. It had been hard work, and they hadn't made it any easier, but he had done his best and John respected him for it. Abby had taken her place instantly as the female leader of the family, ensuring that all the boys not only had clean clothing, but that they wore it. She cared for them and loved them, and she had been a surprising but welcome addition to their family. His other brothers, too, had each contributed something to his life. Joshua's desire to fix things had been John's first inspiration in life, and Judah had helped tremendously with his love of books. Jonathan had provided numerous meals for the family with his remarkable hunting skills, and Jeremiah and Josiah were rowdy playmates. John could only hope that he hadn't made too much trouble for them all. The hangman guided him to the right spot on the wooden platform and brought the noose around his neck. The rough rope scratched at John's skin as the knot was placed just under the left side of his jaw. A few scratches meant nothing if his life was over. John was just grateful that the hangman knew the correct position of the noose's knot. It would break his neck almost instantly when the trapdoor opened, leaving his suffering at only a few seconds. Even in death, he would appreciate careful calculations. And then, of course, there was Catherine. She wandered to the forefront of his mind, almost more important than the rest of his family. She had been mysterious and beautiful, a woman he had instantly wanted to know more about. No other woman had done that to him, and his intrigue had been shot down like a bird the moment she had put him in his place with her knowledge. It had hurt his feelings and offended him, but he had quickly understood how childish he had been. Catherine was beautiful and brilliant. Now he would never have a chance with her. But it would be nice. If he had a chance to do it all over again, John wouldn't have tried to show off at the train yard. He would have paid more attention to what she had to say, and he would have let her know that he was impressed by her proficiency in the operation of trains. Then he would have truly looked at her and seen how gorgeous she was, how the sunlight danced in her auburn hair, how her eyes soaked in everything around her. The wedding reception was going on, but he would have skipped it and invited her out to dinner. Things would have turned out so differently. As his mind wandered and kept him from truly absorbing his predicament, he imagined that he saw the gorgeous red-headed girl riding toward him, her chin forward and her face determined as she guided a mare into the crowd and straight for the gallows. It was a lovely vision, one he would have very much liked to see in real life. Of all the things he regretted, one of them was not getting to say goodbye to her. Stop. Stop right now. Catherine's voice boomed across the square, waking John from his terrified stupor. He's an innocent man. John could see now that Catherine was flanked by Jed, Josiah, and Joshua. Their dark heads bobbed along beside Catherine, their faces stern and worried. John blinked, sure that he wasn't truly seeing this. It was a lovely fantasy. To have the woman of his dreams swoop in and save him from the executioner, but it couldn't really be happening. Catherine was safe at the Rusher farm, and he wouldn't have thought she could ride a horse on her own. But the white mare was shoving through the crowd, her head down as she nuzzled people out of the way. The townsfolk moved aside, some of them angry and others in awe, as this exquisite woman made her way to the gallows. Her back was straight, her chin up and proud. Her hair, unbraided now, rippled in burgundy waves around her shoulders and down her back. It was the deepest red he had ever seen, a beautiful contrast to her pearlescent skin. Catherine. John whispered, afraid to speak out loud lest he anger the hangman and urge him into opening the trapdoor a moment sooner. He wanted every split second he had available to just look at her. Mr. Longer stepped forward, his chin wavering and his hands flapping uselessly at his side. "Catherine, you're all right?" "I'm fine," But I won't be if you let anything happen to this man." She pointed at John again to make her point. "But, darling," Mr. Langer sputtered, "he kidnapped you. He told us that you were at his house, and your leg was found right next to their wagon." "Didn't you get my note?" Catherine demanded. "I knew you would worry about me, but I had John bring it to you." Mr. Langer tapped the tips of his fingers together in front of his ample belly and looked sheepish. "Well, he told me about it. The post office delivered it to my hotel room this morning. I didn't believe him, though, and I had no way of knowing that he hadn't forced you to write it." She glared at her father, then turned the look at John. "You were supposed to give it to him." "I know," John whispered. He gestured at his throat with his bound hands. The noose was tight. "Let him go," Mr. Langer ordered with a twinge of disgust in his voice. The judge rushed forward. "I mean, we did all the paperwork." "You can keep your money, if that's what you're concerned about," Mr. Langer snapped. "Just let him out long enough to talk." The rope scraped against John's cheeks as the hangman ripped it back off him. Even though he hadn't swung from the gallows yet, John relished the fresh air that whooshed into his lungs as he gasped. "Thank you," he choked out. "Now why didn't you give him my letter?" Catherine asked again, more gently this time. John hung his head, ashamed of what he had done. "I'm so sorry. When I arrived in town, everyone was looking for you. They were calling for your kidnapper. I knew that if I gave a letter like that to your father, he would have me arrested, so I arranged to have it delivered." "Then tell me how you ended up in jail and with a rope around your neck." Her green eyes flashed between the two men. Sighing, John did his best to explain. "When your leg was found, it was right near where our wagon was parked for the wedding. Deputy Gaines and several others confronted me about it, and when I tried to explain, they hauled me off to jail. And you just let him sit in there and rot." Catherine's voice was sharp once again. She was going to get to the bottom of this, but John wasn't sure he had the energy to spell it out for her. Mr. Langer had been catering to his daughter's will, but he turned angry once again. "I was doing what I had to do. For all I knew, I was never going to see you again. You can't be angry with me for finding the man I thought had kidnapped you." Catherine had dropped the reins, and she put both fists on her hips. "Yes, I can, since I wasn't kidnapped." "Then maybe you should tell me just what did happen to you," Mr. Langer growled. She sighed. Her hair had fallen forward, and she pushed it back over her shoulder. "It's a little ridiculous and a little embarrassing. Maybe there's someplace else we can go to talk," John suggested. It was for Catherine's sake, because he didn't want her to be humiliated, but he was also ready to sit down for a bit. Spending the night in jail and almost being hung had taken a lot out of him. "Yes, we can head back to the hotel for a moment," Mr. Langer said. "Catherine needs a chance to clean up anyway." "But the prisoner!" Judge Murphy cried. Mr. Langer spun on his heel and glared at the man. "Just say that I dropped the charges or something. I'm sure you can figure it out." He stomped down off the platform of the gallows toward his daughter, not waiting for John. The innkeeper allowed Catherine, Mr. Langer, John, Jed, Joshua, and Josiah into the lobby, along with Deputy Gaines, just for safety. He shut and locked the door behind them to keep the rest of the mob from coming in. The townsfolk of Woodland were interested in hearing the aftermath of the supposed kidnapping and the almost hanging, but they were cut off. It was a long evening as they sat around discussing events. Mr. Langer listened closely as Catherine, once she had changed back into one of her own gowns and had her wooden leg back, described exactly how she had ended up in the back of the rusher's wagon. When she was finished, he ran his hand down his face and looked at her with tired eyes. "There's one thing I don't understand," he said. "What exactly were you doing climbing on the wagon? What were you trying to see?" Catherine blushed, a pink color suddenly the background for her freckles. "Well, I was looking into the hotel windows." "But why?" Mr. Langer was exasperated now. He'd had enough of trying to decipher everyone else's antics and their reasons for them. "You were supposed to go in the hotel and check into your room." She looked down at her lap. Her hair had been freshly braided, and she couldn't hide her face behind her hair. "Yes, I was. But John was in there. I wanted to avoid him because we hadn't seemed to get along." John stared, jerking upright in his seat, and turned to look at her. "You were?" "I was too shy," she admitted, her eyes still in her lap. "I figured you thought I was odd for knowing so much about trains. I assumed you didn't want to talk to a woman like that." Closing his eyes and tipping his head back, John realized what an idiot he had been. He had known he had made some mistakes, but now that Catherine had told him exactly how he had made her feel, it made it even worse. This kind, smart woman had simply tried to start a conversation, and it must have truly hurt her feelings when he had rejected her. If he hadn't been such a fool, her injury and his incarceration never would have happened. "Catherine, I'm so sorry. I really am. I was just being foolish. People don't usually like to hear me talk about things like trains or other machines, so I'm not used to having an active conversation with someone about them. If I could go back and do it all over again, I certainly would." She looked at him, the barest glimmer of tears in her emerald eyes. "That's all right, John. I don't think I would have." He raised his eyebrows, surprised. He must truly have hurt her. "What I mean," Catherine said when she saw the look on his face, "is that I wouldn't change a thing because it couldn't have turned out better. If things had gone differently at the train yard, I might have only had a small exchange with you and then never seen you again. Falling into that wagon was painful, scary, and embarrassing, but if it hadn't happened, I never would have met all of you." She smiled a little and finally looked up. Her eyes first went to Jed. "You have such a lovely farm, and I am so glad I got to spend a little time there. Your wife is the kindest, most generous hostess. You were all so wonderful to me in my time of need, and you gave me far more than simple hospitality deserved." Jed looked abashed. It was nothing. "It wasn't," Catherine insisted. "It was everything." She turned then to John. "And I know we didn't get to spend much time together, but it warms my heart to know that there is someone out there who has the same interests as I do. You're very intelligent, and I know you'll continue to use that knowledge to benefit your farm. I want you to know how grateful I am to you just for letting me know you exist." John was flabbergasted. Nobody had appreciated him in quite that manner before. His mother had acknowledged how smart he was as a young boy, encouraging him to fix the gate on the chicken coop or the leg on the coffee table. His brothers had made good use of the devices he had created around the farm. But it just wasn't quite the same. "I really don't know what to say, Catherine." "Thank you." "Well, this is all well and good, but the most important thing is that Catherine is back where she belongs." Mr. Langer stood up from the table and pushed in his chair, indicating that he was done talking. "Now we can get back on our regular schedule and have everything normal again." John remained seated for a moment, watching Catherine. "What comes next for you?" She looked up at her father for a moment before looking at John. "Well, I suppose we'll keep traveling for a little while," she responded quietly. "It's what we do. But I think we'll be coming back this way sometime. Papa has talked about retiring here. She sounded more bright and hopeful now. I'm not so sure anymore, Mr. Langer replied. This hasn't exactly been the relaxing trip that Cousin Maggie promised me. Papa! Don't be silly. What happened had nothing to do with Cousin Maggie or Woodland. Catherine arched her eyebrows at her father in annoyance. Still, I can't say that I'll have good memories. But I'm sure we'll come back this way at some point. John watched Mr. Langer just as intently as his daughter did, looking for some sort of hope that he might be able to see her again. It's not something I'm willing to decide right at this moment. Anyway, Mr. Langer's hair, normally smooth and perfect, was now a spidery cascade of silver strands around his ears. His fine suit coat had lost a button, and his trousers were wrinkled. He looked just like the rest of them felt. I'm ready to go to bed. I suppose we all better get going, Jed agreed. He stood and led the group to the door. I'll just walk you outside, Catherine offered. Night had descended fully now. Most of the homes and businesses in Woodland had turned out their lights, their occupants having gone to bed. Everything was quiet and peaceful, a remarkable contrast to the chaos that had taken over the town for the last 2 days. John was grateful for his life, and he breathed in as much of the fresh California air as his lungs would allow. Jed, Joshua, and Josiah quickly freed their horses from the hitching post and walked them down the road, leaving John and Catherine alone on the porch of the hotel. They stood out in the middle of the square, ostensibly checking their girths and adjusting their reins. John untied Abby's mare, holding the reins in one hand. He knew he should be relieved to be going home. Even more, he should be happy to be sleeping in his own bed that night and not on the sofa. But Catherine had completely changed his life, and it didn't seem right to have to simply move on. It doesn't sound like I'll be seeing you again anytime soon, he said honestly. It was best not to toy around with it and be direct. Catherine's face was shadowed, but the moonlight limned her features with subtle beauty. He says that now, but it doesn't mean it will stay that way. Give him a little bit of time to get over everything, and I'm sure I can convince him to come back. John nodded, taking a step closer to her. It would be nice to see you again. I would love to see your trains and to get a good lesson on how they work. She smiled, the curve of her cheek increasing in the pale light. I think you have just as much to teach me as I do you. But yes, it would be wonderful. She paused for a moment, biting her lip. We should still be in town for a little while. Papa still has business in town. I don't think he got much done the last few days. John stepped backward, undoing his forward advance toward her. I don't want to upset your father. I've caused plenty of trouble as it is, and you need some time to rest. He wanted desperately to promise her he would return to the hotel the next day to ask her to have a meal with him, even just to walk around in the sunshine and spend time together. But it wasn't fair to ask that of her, not when he knew they would soon be separated by many miles and perhaps many months. She closed the distance between them, once again standing just far enough away to be proper but close enough that she could easily rest her hand against his forearm. I've rested quite well over the last couple of days. Today has been harrowing. Yes, but I'm sure I'll be ready to see you again after a good night's sleep. John wasn't sure what to say. Catherine was giving him an open invitation to come and visit her. Now that the townspeople knew his intentions were honorable, there should be no reason for him not to do so. But still, he felt hesitant. Maybe. I know I have some work to do. His time in jail had seemed to cut down on his interest in mechanics and engineering. He had been cold, sad, and worried for his life. But now that things were okay again and he was standing there with Catherine, ideas began swirling around once more. He could see everything that needed to be done, and he understood how he could accomplish it. The notion tensed his muscles and itched at his skin, urging him so strongly to act on it that he could no longer stand there in the darkness with Catherine. "I have to go." "Can I tell you something first?" she asked quietly. "Of course." Catherine came forward and patted the mare. "I have to tell you that the animals on your farm are quite stunning. The dog, Lucy, she was the one who helped me get to the house when I woke up in the barn, and the horse was marvelous. I hadn't ridden in ages, but I swear she shifted every time she felt me slipping a little, just to make sure I was safe. She leaned against the horse, her cheek pressed to the strong flesh of the mare's withers. I'm glad to know that you had both my family and the animals to look after you. I only wish that it could have been me." The mare took that moment to shift her weight, swiftly removing her shoulders and her support from underneath Catherine. The motion caught her off guard and her wooden leg buckled beneath her, sending her flying forward. John caught her easily in his arms. "I have to go," he said again, his heart pounding as he looked down into her face. His breath caught in his lungs at their proximity. He had envisioned this numerous times over the last few days, but he had to go. "I'll see you again soon." Once he had ensured that she was on her feet again, John mounted up and rode off toward home. Chapter 14. The next day, Catherine waited hopefully in the hotel lobby for John to arrive. They hadn't made any concrete plans together, but she was convinced that he would show. He had seemed just as interested in spending time with her as she had him, and it was only right that they take advantage of what little time they had while she was in Woodland. "I'm heading out to the train yard," her father said at breakfast as he scooped the last of his soft-boiled egg out of its shell. "I'd like you to stay here for the day. I'm sure you understand." Catherine nodded and picked at her toast. "Yes, Papa. That would be fine." She understood perfectly. The train yard was now nothing but a source of woe for Mr. Langer. His daughter had been injured there as a child, and then he had believed her to be kidnapped. He wouldn't be asking her to come to work with him for a long time. "I'm sure you'll find a way to entertain yourself." He stood and buttoned his suit coat, his tidy appearance restored after the events of the previous day. "There's a print shop just down the street. I don't mind if you go there, but other than that, I'd like you to stay here." His voice and his countenance were stern. "Yes, Papa." When John arrived, he could accompany her to the print shop. The two of them could also converse in the lobby of the hotel. He might be disappointed at not going to the train yard, but she was sure he would understand. But by the time Mr. Langer arrived back at the hotel for supper, John had yet to appear. Catherine had peeked out the windows, hoping to see him riding down the street. She had even gone ahead to the print shop on her own and asked the innkeeper when she got back if anyone had called for her. Nobody had. Catherine went to bed that night, biting back tears. She thought she'd had something special with John, a unique friendship if nothing else. She knew that he had not promised her a visit, but she had still imagined that he would come. 2 more days passed without word from any of the rushers. Mr. Langer seemed pleased, his usual jovial moods returning completely. Catherine, however, stayed in her room most of the day, claiming she was tired. The next day, with only 1 day left before they were to leave, a knock came at the door. Catherine, having just packed everything except for her traveling clothes, crossed the room to open it. It was probably the maid bringing her fresh water. She opened the door to find the maid standing in the hall, but instead of a pitcher of water, she held a large box. It was long and skinny, but the maid held it easily in her arms. "A package has arrived for you, miss." Catherine stooped to help her bring it into the room, excitement building inside her chest. They laid it down in the middle of the floor. Who would have sent her something? There was no name on the outside of the box except for her own. She quickly closed the door behind the maid and returned to open it. The packing material inside gave way to a new prosthetic leg. It was beautifully sculpted, with a delicate foot that would fit perfectly into a lady's shoe. The straps and buckles at the top were made differently than on her current leg. There were more of them, and there were more holes in the leather to make the buckles more adjustable. The top of the leg was lined with a soft, squishy padding that would conform well to her leg and allow for a good fit. Sitting down on the edge of the bed, Catherine couldn't take off the old leg fast enough. Her fingers shook as she picked at the buckles. Finally, it fell to the floor with a heavy thump. Catherine left it there, hopping to the center of the room and eagerly lifting the new leg out of the box. Attaching it was remarkably easy. She had no problem getting it to fit nice and tightly against her skin without pinching, and it was so lightweight that it was easy to maneuver. She grabbed the bedpost and hauled herself to her feet, quickly finding her balance on her new leg. "This is incredible," she said to her reflection as she admired the leg in the mirror. Once she put a shoe on it, nobody would know the difference. Catherine had never felt so beautiful and mobile in all her life. A square of white in the box caught her eye, and Catherine bent to retrieve it. It was a note, the handwriting small and careful. "Dearest Catherine, I'm sorry it took me so long to get this to you. I had to be sure it was perfect, as it is meant for a perfect woman. Will you marry me? Love, oh, John. Tears sprang to her eyes, and she swiped at them. There was no time for crying. Catherine raced out into the hallway, the new leg coming right along with her, instead of tripping her up. She hadn't gone so fast down a set of stairs since she was a child, and if she had been any happier, she could simply have sailed down into the lobby. Her father had emerged from his hotel room just in time to see her antics. "Slow down," he cried. But Catherine knew that was one command she could never obey. Not now. Her body soared just as much as her heart did. "I can't." She glanced quickly through the lobby, but there was no sign of John. Only a few patrons sat at tables near the back, lazily picking at a late breakfast. She burst out through the front door, ready to run down to the livery stable and rent the fastest horse they had to take her to the Rusher farm. But John was there, standing on the street in front of the hotel. Instead of the shirt and trousers he wore for farm work, he was dressed in a suit. It wasn't made of the fine materials that her father bought, but it was handsome nevertheless. He clutched a bouquet of flowers in his hand. His green eyes were hopeful behind his glasses. She didn't wait for him to ask her again. Catherine charged forward, jumping off the porch with glee and landing in his arms. He held her tightly, spinning her around in the street. She pressed her lips to his, an unknown thrill charging through her body. She would never be able to get enough of this. "Yes, John Rusher, I will absolutely marry you." The end. Thank you for listening. Here at PureRead, we aim to serve you, our dear readers and listeners, with good, clean Christian stories. You can be assured that any PureRead book you pick up will not only be hugely enjoyable, but free of any objectionable content. We are deeply thankful to you for choosing our books. Your support means that we can continue to provide stories like the one you have just listened to. To browse our range of clean and wholesome titles, go to PureRead.com. Please like and subscribe to our channel. That way you'll be the first to hear when new stories arrive here for your enjoyment. God bless you, and thank you again for listening.